In the dead lands of Eldgrave, they say the wind once screamed, not from storms, but from a crown forged in the agony of traitors. A crown that never stopped feeding. A king who spoke in tongues not even the gods remembered. A mother who wore death like armor. And a scream so loud, it burned a kingdom from memory. This isn't history. This isn't myth. This is the curse that outlived them both. What if the most powerful throne in the Dark Ages was never meant to be sat upon at all? Stay with us, because once you hear the scream, you won't be able to leave. There is a valley in the north that maps have long since abandoned, not for its lack of roads, but because those who entered it rarely returned with their minds intact. Locals call it Eldgrave. No kingdom claims it. No banners fly over its hills. But high upon its crooked spine sits the remnants of a keep, black-stoned, broken, and leaning like a drunk noble who's heard one too many confessions. Travelers who dare pass through the shrouded woodlands below say the keep howls just after sunset. Not wind, not wolves. A scream, one that starts low, like an iron gate being dragged across cobblestones, then rises, rising until the trees themselves seem to tremble. They say the ground shakes, that birds never return to their nests, that even the moon turns away. Few believe these tales anymore. The monks at Highgate call them drunken legends whispered by desperate peasants. But on the eve of the Year of Withered Light, a wandering monk named Brother Calin crossed into Eldgrave Valley and vanished from the world above. The last anyone saw of him, he stood at the edge of the valley with his hood drawn tight and a single candle lit in his hand, muttering a prayer not known in any tongue the church recorded. The peasants begged him not to go. They warned him of the Black Keep song. But he simply smiled and said, "Truth lives in ruins where kings once lied." 14 days later, a horse with no rider returned to Highgate Abbey. Its flanks were slashed. Its eyes rolled wild. And tied to its saddle was a tattered scroll sealed with black wax, stamped with a crown made of jagged blades. The Abbey elders debated for hours before unsealing it. And when they did, the walls of the hall turned cold. The scroll was not written in ink, but in blood. The words were few, desperate. Beware the crown of Eldgrave. Forged not in gold, but in agony. They burned the scroll, buried the ashes, and sealed the records. But whispers spread faster than fire, and soon all of Westreach murmured the name again, Eldgrave. Brother Calin had always been a man unshaken by superstition. Raised among the libraries of the Iron Monks, his mind was trained to parse truth from myth. But even he had hesitated when he first glimpsed the valley. It lay cloaked in a veil of pale mist, moving unnaturally, not with the breeze, but against it. The trees were crooked, bent as though bowing toward the keep. No birds sang. No wolves howled. Even the insects kept silent. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath. But Calin pressed on. He followed a forgotten path overgrown with briars and stone teeth. The higher he climbed, the heavier the air grew, thick with the scent of rusted iron and something older, decay not of flesh, but of memory. A sickness of the land itself. By the time he reached the outer wall, night had already fallen, and the moon was hidden behind clouds like a scared child behind its mother's skirt. The keep stood before him, not crumbled, but exhausted. Its walls bore scars of fire and blade. Its towers leaned as though whispering secrets to each other. And its gate, once iron and proud, now hung limp like a jaw broken in battle. But what drew Calin forward was not the sight. It was the sound. A soft hum, but metallic, as though something deep within the stone was breathing. Not in rhythm with the wind, but with memory. With vengeance. Inside, the halls were coated in grime and cobwebs thick as tapestries. But the structure still stood. A throne room without a throne. A war chamber with rusted weapons fused to the walls. A chapel turned upside down, the altar shattered, and symbols of the old gods defaced with claw marks. He lit his lantern and descended further, beneath the keep, into its belly. The stairs twisted like they'd been built by a drunk architect or a mad priest. Along the walls, ancient carvings had been scratched away. But one symbol remained, burned into the stone. A crown, not smooth or regal, but jagged, violent. Its points were blades, Its base was made of screaming mouths. Kalen traced the symbol with a trembling hand, and as his fingers touched the stone, the humming deepened. It became a voice, distant, fractured, like hearing someone scream underwater. The words came slowly, syllables broken by centuries of silence. Kalen's heart pounded. He dropped the lantern. It shattered, plunging him into darkness. And then the scream. Not a sound of pain. Not even of terror. It was older than both. It was a sound that should never exist. The scream of metal being forced to remember. The scream of blood being rewritten. It echoed through the halls, vibrating the stones. Kalen fled, stumbling, clawing, praying. He reached a side chamber, what might have once been a scribe's quarters. There, half buried in debris, he found the scroll. Written in dried, brown flakes. The same message. The same warning. Forged not in gold, but in agony. And beneath it, a list of 10 names. Nobles. Emperors. All long dead. All cursed. The last name, freshly etched, was Aldrich of Westreach. Kalen knew that name. The young duke. The warlord rising through the kingdom's ranks. A man who, despite youth, had never lost a single battle. Rumors said he wore no crown. Only a circlet of iron too sharp to touch. And that he spoke in dreams to things that answered back. Kalen did not leave through the gate. He fled through the undercrypt, into tunnels lined with bones too large to be human. He rode the first horse he could find, one still breathing, and carved the warning onto the scroll before passing out from fear or madness. But he never made it back. The scroll now lies buried in a sealed chest beneath Highgate Abbey. But those who walk its halls at night sometimes hear the sound of scratching, as though the scroll writes itself anew. And when the wind is just right, and the mist rolls low across the valley, Eldgrave's scream can still be heard, even from the abbey walls. They say it's just the wind. They say the past is buried. They are wrong. The crown of Eldgrave waits. And it is hungry. 300 years before Eldgrave Keep fell silent, it stood as the heart of a kingdom feared across the known world. Its towers pierced the sky like spears. Its gates could hold back entire armies. And its throne, carved from stone veined with molten iron, was said to have been hewn from a fallen star. Upon that throne sat King Roderick the Iron-Jawed, a warlord turned monarch, a man who had never lost a siege nor forgiven a betrayal. He ruled with both blade and fire, believing mercy was a currency of the weak. Yet his kingdom did not hate him. It feared him, and fear in those days bought peace. But peace never lasts. In the final year of his reign, famine spread across the lower provinces. Crops withered, rivers dried, and whispers began to rise like smoke that the king had struck a pact with the underworld to forge his iron rule, that the price had come due, that his throne had begun to rot from within. Roderick ignored the omens. He hung those who questioned him. He burned the temples of seers who foretold his end. And still, the shadows lengthened. One by one, his closest advisors vanished, not in battle, but in silence. His own bloodline began to conspire. The rot had spread to his kin. It began with Prince Daimar, his youngest son, whose voice was honeyed with deceit. Then Lord Torin, the king's nephew, a general whose sword had spilled rivers of blood for the realm. And finally, Queen Adrienne, Roderick's third and final wife, a woman of cold ambition, born of a noble house known more for poison than politics. On the eve of the autumn solstice, as the black moon rose above the keep, the great hall filled with a quiet treachery. Torches flickered. Shadows danced. The guards posted at the king's chamber had vanished. And Roderick, long feared by nations, found himself surrounded not by armies, but by those who bore his name. They did not wear armor. They wore silk. Not swords, daggers. Poison on their fingertips. Lies behind their eyes. Roderick fought, of course. His blade took 6 lives before they brought him to his knees. Blood poured from a dozen wounds. And still, he cursed them with every breath. They dragged him, a king once worshipped like a god, across the marble floor of his throne room. His iron crown, bent and smeared with blood, lay atop the throne like a vulture awaiting its feast. They did not kill him with honor. They beat him with ceremonial staves. They spat upon him. And finally, with the court watching in cold silence, they raised him up one last time. Roderick laughed. Even with broken teeth, he laughed. And with his final breath, he looked upon the crown, then upon his traitorous kin, and uttered a curse not heard in the realm before or since. May none wear my crown without drowning in my screams. The silence that followed was unnatural. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to die. The air grew heavy, the walls groaned, and for a moment, all those present felt the weight of something ancient waking. Prince Daimar stepped forward to claim the crown. It cut his hand before he could lift it. A single drop of blood hit the iron, and the crown hissed, a sound like steam and bone cracking. Daimar recoiled, but the others urged him on. He raised the crown above his head, and in that moment, the very walls of Eldgrave shuddered. Paintings cracked. Statues toppled. The Iron Throne, untouched for centuries, groaned as though mourning. Daimar set the crown upon his brow and screamed, not in pain, not in madness, but in both twisted together, as if the scream came not from his throat, but from the depths of his soul. He dropped to his knees. His skin began to blister. His eyes rolled back, showing only white. And his voice, it shifted. It echoed. The court heard not Daimar's voice, but Roderick's. May none wear my crown. The crown fell from his head, hitting the floor with a sound like a hammer upon a tombstone. He lived, but never spoke again. The others were shaken, but not dissuaded. Torin tried next. He lasted 5 seconds before collapsing in spasms, bleeding from his ears. His limbs twisted as though unseen hands were breaking him from within. He died that night, muttering Roderick's name in reverse, over and over. The queen never dared try. Instead, the crown was locked away, sealed in a vault beneath the keep, guarded not by men, but by spells and steel. No songs were sung, no coronation held. The realm fractured, with lords fighting over scraps of land. Eldgrave fell into silence, but the crown remained. Whispers say that over the decades that followed, each time a noble tried to restore the kingdom, they sought the crown. And each time, they failed. Some were found clawing their own faces. Others disappeared into the crypts, never to be seen again. One heir, it said, simply burned to ash the moment the crown neared his brow. Roderick's curse was not just words. It had soaked into the iron, into the very shape of the crown, into the air around it, into the stones of Eldgrave itself. It was not only forged in agony, it now carried agony. It spoke to those who neared it, in dreams, in whispers, in screams. By the 2nd century after Roderick's fall, the crown was no longer spoken of in courts. It had become myth, a thing feared by those too old to believe in monsters. The keep itself was abandoned, left to rot atop the hill like a scab never picked. But legends have a way of breathing in silence. And across the mountains, a warlord was rising. Aldrich of Westreach, a boy born in shadows, raised by a family erased from records. A man who conquered cities with no army, who wore not a golden crown, but a circlet of scorched iron. When asked where he found it, he said nothing, only that it sang to him in his sleep. The monks of Highgate would later record that on the night Aldrich was crowned, a tremor was felt across the valley, that the dead in forgotten graves turned to face the east, that wolves howled for hours, then went silent, never howling again, and that from the black keep of Eldgrave, long thought ruined, a new light was seen. A red light, flickering, pulsing, like the beating heart of something ancient that had waited long to wake. They say that in the stillness of night, if one stands at the edge of the valley and listens, really listens, they can still hear Roderick. He is not resting. He is screaming, and his crown still waits for the next fool to bleed upon it. They called him Eric of Hollowgate, a name only the oldest villagers remembered, spoken in half-whispers as if it might summon something from the shadows. He lived alone, far beyond the timberline where the wind howled like wolves learning to speak. His forge, carved into the bones of a forgotten mine, hadn't burned in over a decade. No one knew why he stopped. Once, his blades had hung in every noble hall from Greyreach to the Crimson March. His work was legendary, not for its beauty, but for its brutality. Eric's swords didn't shine, they devoured light. His hammers struck not with sound, but with silence that cracked the bones of those nearby. He made weapons meant not for ceremony, but for war. Then one day, he vanished from the cities. Some say he killed a king with a blade too perfect. Others claim he made a pact beneath the stone abbey and swore never to forge again. Whatever the truth, his forge grew cold. The anvil gathered dust, and Eric was forgotten until the voices returned. It began with a dream, a river of blood, 10 swords rising from it like skeletal fingers, a crown hovering above them, dripping with something darker than death, and a voice, hollow, ancient, not spoken into his ear, but poured directly into his skull. You forged for kings. Now forge for screams. Eric woke in a cold sweat. His fists clenched so tightly the nails had broken the skin of his palms. He stood, heart pounding, breath ragged, and realized something was wrong. His forge, cold for years, was lit. The coals burned without fire. The iron glowed without heat. And the hammer, it was ringing. Not from impact, but from memory. He should have fled. But something in his chest, a pull, a hunger, drove him to walk toward it. The bellows he had not touched in a decade began to heave on their own. Sparks flew, dancing like insects made of fire. And there, atop the coals, sat 10 rusted swords. Eric had not brought them, but he knew their names. Each blade had belonged to a traitor. Murderers, oath-breakers, kinslayers. Weapons that had ended empires and slaughtered saints. Somehow, they had found their way to his forge. And the voice returned. Melt betrayal. Shape vengeance. He fought it. For hours, perhaps days. He screamed until his throat gave out. But the hammer would not let go. His hands moved without command. Sweat poured like rain from his skin. And still he struck, again and again, metal bending not from heat, but from will. Each blade resisted. They screamed, as if the souls trapped inside clawed to escape. But Eric's hammer knew no mercy. He did not forge a crown of gold. He forged a crown of agony. It took 9 nights. On the 10th, he collapsed, the crown complete, jagged, sharp, vicious. It looked nothing like a symbol of royalty. It was a weapon, a trap, a wound made solid. The metal pulsed faintly as if breathing, and around its base, 10 etchings glowed, names scratched in runes long forgotten by men. The names of the traitors. Eric should have destroyed it. Instead, he knelt. The crown did not speak to him. It screamed, not into the air, but into his bones. A sound so raw, so violent, that his body spasmed. Blood poured from his ears. His teeth shattered in his mouth. He was not wearing it, but the crown was already inside him. He awoke hours later, or maybe years. Time had lost meaning. The forge was cold again. The crown sat on the anvil, unmoved. But Eric, once a mountain of muscle, now looked hollow, as if the hammer had broken not just metal, but his soul. He wrapped the crown in black cloth, sealed it in an iron box, and carved a warning in his forge. This was not made by hands. He buried the box beneath the old oak at the edge of the world, a tree said to have grown from the heart of a fallen god. There it slept, or so he hoped. But the voice never stopped. It followed him in dreams, in echoes, in the silence between breaths. It began to twist his vision. When he closed his eyes, he no longer saw steel or fire. He saw thrones, empty and waiting. He saw kings clawing at their skulls. He saw blood falling like rain across fields of bone. And always, the crown was there. Years passed. Eric aged, but the voice did not. Travelers began reporting strange things near the forge. Animals born without eyes. Trees that bled sap black as ink. The wind carried whispers. Children disappeared. No one dared go near the hollow mountain anymore. One spring, a stranger came, clad in ash-colored armor, his face hidden beneath a hood stitched from crow feathers. He spoke no name, but he knew the stories. He asked for Eric. The blacksmith did not answer the door, but the forge was lit again. The stranger waited outside for 3 days. Then he left, but not alone. The crown had vanished. They say it resurfaced in Westreach a decade later, upon the brow of a warlord no one had seen before. A man who won battles he never should have survived, who never blinked, who never bled. They say the crown he wore was not placed on his head, it grew from it. The soldiers who followed him claimed he spoke in tongues at night, whispering to something that hissed back from the dark. His sword never dulled. His army never slept. And in every town they conquered, children woke screaming without knowing why. One night, a soldier defected. He was found a week later, his tongue fused to his spine, his eyes burned out, yet still alive, still murmuring. He said only one thing over and over. The blacksmith built the end. Eric was never seen again. Some believe he fled into the eastern deserts, where the dead walk at dusk. Others say he returned to the forge and melted himself into the coals. But a few, the ones who still remember the old ways, believe he is still alive. Not as a man, but as a whisper inside the crown. A warning, or perhaps a guide. After all, he did not forge it for kings. He forged it for screams. And the crown, it remembers its maker. It did not rust. It should have, left alone beneath the old oak at the edge of the world, sealed in iron, swaddled in shadows, far from the touch of man or sun. But the crown did not decay. The box that held it rotted from within. The iron corroded. Worms devoured the wood. Yet the crown endured. Worse, it breathed, not with lungs or warmth, but with presence. Even underground, it hummed faintly. A pulse of iron, a whisper of madness. And when night fell across the hills of Hollowgate, the roots of the tree above it twisted. The birds grew silent. The ground trembled, though no one walked it. Eventually, it was found. Not by kings, not by knights, but by the lost. A scavenger girl, skin pale from hunger, teeth missing from rot, clawed her way through the earth in search of nothing more than roots to chew. She was the first in years to set foot near the oak. And it called to her, not in words, but in need. She dug, hands raw, nails cracked. When she found the iron box, she opened it without question. And the scream began. It was not her own. It came from the crown. A soft, wavering wail, like the last breath of a dying animal stretched across time. The girl dropped the box and fled, but her skin had already begun to change. Her eyes turned the color of ash. Her mouth filled with blackened spit. She vanished into the trees that night, and when hunters found her days later, she had torn out her tongue with her own hands. The crown was gone. The village burned weeks later. No enemy approached. No fire was seen. But in the morning, ash covered the hills. No bodies were found. Only teeth. The legend returned. Those who wore it never did so willingly. Some found it buried in graves it did not belong to. Others swore it simply appeared beside them after dreams soaked in screams. In every case, the result was the same. Touch it and it sings. Not a song of joy. Not a melody of kingship or power. But a scream, low, distorted, older than language. It drags itself into the listener's mind, tearing through thought like claws through parchment. The first sensation is cold. Not physical cold, but a chill of memory, as though someone else's grief has been stitched into your bones. Then come the visions. Blood, so much blood. Battlefields black with the dead. Skies that rain iron. Screams layered upon screams until the mind fractures. And always, at the center of it, a face. Gaunt, trunk, mouth open, gasping. King Roderick. He appears in every vision. Not as a corpse. Not as a ghost. But as something still alive, still trapped in the iron. The crown does not show its victims their own death. It shows them his. Over and over. Every blade. Every betrayal. Every breath. Until they scream with him. There were attempts to destroy it. A high priest bathed it in sacred oil, struck it with a warhammer forged from celestial bronze. The hammer shattered. The priest burst into flame. His ashes spelled the word, why. A group of witches threw it into the sea. For 7 days, the ocean boiled. Fish washed ashore with their eyes melted shut. On the 8th day, The crown reappeared, sitting at the foot of the eldest witch's bed. She hanged herself with her own hair that night. A scholar from the south tried to encase it in glass infused with silver runes. The glass cracked before it touched the crown. The runes rearranged themselves into screams, and the scholar's eyes turned backward. He wrote nothing after that, only pressed his bloodied forehead against the walls of his cell, whispering, "He remembers." The whispers spread again, not from mouths, but from minds. People dreamt of the crown without ever seeing it. Children drew it in the dirt. Cattle refused to enter barns where its name had been spoken. Entire towns vanished overnight, leaving only the faint wail of something far away. The crown did not sit idly. It searched, not for a king, but for a vessel. It wanted not to be worn, but to be felt, to be feared, to be remembered. And it found one, a young noble named Aldrich, barely a man, born in a forgotten province, the son of a baron executed for treason, a boy raised in silence, surrounded by crows. He was not remarkable, not until the night his village was slaughtered. No survivors, no raiders, no fire, just silence. And in the center of the ruin, Aldrich, kneeling, with the crown in his hands. He did not scream. He did not fall. He placed it upon his brow with the calm of one answering a question already known. The crown screamed, but Aldrich did not. His eyes turned black. His heart stopped, and then started again. 3 beats slower. He rose. In the months that followed, stories emerged. A man dressed in shadows marching with no army. Villages falling into submission without a single sword raised. Priests abandoning temples at his approach. Statues cracking. Dogs dying. Bells ringing without being touched. The crown did not shine. It absorbed light. In paintings, it could not be drawn. In stories, it could not be described. But all agreed on one thing. It screamed, only once each night as the moon reached its peak. A long, slow howl that rolled across valleys and mountain passes, shaking leaves from trees, turning milk sour, driving sleepers to nightmares they could not escape. The scream never changed. The same length, the same pitch, as though trapped in time. Those who studied it realized the truth. It was Roderick. It had always been Roderick. His final breath, his final curse, not spoken into the air, but hammered into iron by Eric's hand, bound by blood and vengeance. The crown was not a crown. It was a prison, a sentence, a weapon. And now it walked again. Aldrich grew in power, not with soldiers or coin, with fear. He spoke rarely. When he did, his voice echoed, not just aloud, but within others, like the scream of the crown, but quieter, gentler, crueler. Those who met his gaze swore they saw memories not their own. One night wept for 3 days, claiming to have seen every death that had ever occurred in his bloodline. Another slit his own throat, whispering, "The king remembers. The king remembers." The crown did not rest. It whispered in the dark. It pulsed with every heartbeat. And wherever Aldrich went, it grew louder. Graves opened. Children choked on silence. The old wept without knowing why. Yet Aldrich did not remove it. He did not tremble. He did not cry. It was as if the screams fed him. There was only one who tried to stop him. A former knight of Eldgrave, old and broken, blinded in war. He found Aldrich in the ruins of a chapel, where the crown had once been buried in sacrilege. The knight, though frail, raised a blade carved from moonstone, a weapon said to silence gods. Aldrich turned. He did not lift a hand. He did not speak. The crown did. Its scream blasted the knight backwards, shattering his sword to dust. He struck a stone pillar, bones snapping like branches. As he bled, the knight reached toward Aldrich, tears streaming from hollow sockets. And Aldrich knelt beside him. He placed a hand on the dying man's chest and whispered, "Do you hear him too?" The knight's final breath was a scream, not his own, Roderick's. The crown would not be taken again. It had chosen, and its voice would no longer stay buried in iron. There are rulers who seize power with ambition, others who inherit it with dread, and a rare few who stumble into it by curse. Aldrich of Westreach was never meant to rule. Born to a disgraced house whose name was scrubbed from the royal registries, he lived in the shadow of obscurity, raised not in courts but among ruins, not by nobles but by outcasts. His family had fallen during the Fifth Uprising, branded as traitors after refusing to swear fealty to the Eastern High Lords. Aldrich's father was hanged in public and his mother imprisoned in the salt pits of Velgard. The boy was smuggled away in a grain cart by a one-eyed knight who believed in omens, and hidden in the outer marshes of Hollow Reach, where the fog devours even the stars. He grew up silent, observing, unaffected by the warmth of men or the cruelty of war. They say he spoke only to crows and shadows. And then one night he disappeared. He returned years later with the crown. Not as a prince, nor as a warlord. Not even as a man with ambition. He arrived at the gates of the border hold alone, barefoot, soaked in rain and blood. His clothes hung in rags. His eyes were blank, but on his head sat the iron crown. The same crown once forged by Eric. The same crown sealed beneath roots and bone. It was rustless, but faintly humming. The guards should have struck him down where he stood, but none moved. One soldier, known for his fearlessness in the siege of Thornspire, dropped his sword the moment Aldrich lifted his gaze. He later confessed that the young man's eyes glowed, not with fire, but with something worse. A soft red light, like blood caught in moonlight. That night, Aldrich did not request entry. The gates opened on their own. By dawn, the border hold was his. It began subtly, then spread like rot. Aldrich spoke little. When he did, it was in riddles. He never mentioned the crown, never acknowledged its weight, but his commands were absolute. Men followed without question. Lords bent knee without understanding why. At first, the land prospered. Tides lowered. Thieves vanished. Crops doubled. But with each full moon, something changed. Aldrich no longer dined with his court. He no longer appeared during daylight. And at night, screams could be heard echoing from the old hallways of the keep. When questioned, his chamberlain said only, "He listens to them now." No one asked who they were. Soon the conquests began. But there were no armies. Aldrich traveled alone, unarmed, unarmored, yet entire baronies surrendered upon seeing him. Those who resisted died in peculiar ways, bleeding from the nose, their skin shriveled like burnt parchment. One knight who dared draw steel against him fell mid-charge, clutching his skull, mumbling, make it stop," until his voice cracked and his lungs gave out. The crown never left his head. Its edges, once jagged, now seemed sharper, as if growing, hungering. Witnesses claimed it pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. And the glow in Aldrich's eyes deepened. They called him the Hollow Duke. He ruled not with decrees, but with presence. No banners were raised, no oaths spoken. And yet, within months, the lands from Hollow Reach to Blackfen bent to his will. He never smiled, never raged. He simply stood and listened. He said little, except one phrase whispered often into the stillness. "They are guiding me." Those who asked who found themselves mute by sunrise. Their tongues blackened, their memories erased. He was no longer a man. He was a vessel. Inside the ancient tower of Darnhold, a secret council of surviving kings gathered. Word had reached them of a rising darkness. Lands were falling without war. Villages were forgetting their names. The stars above Aldrich's domain now flickered red. They spoke of curses, of lost crowns, of forbidden myths buried after the fall of King Roderick. But none dared name the crown aloud. One king did. An old man, wrinkled and half-blind, who had once ridden alongside Aldrich's father in the days before the Purge. He said 3 words, "The screaming crown." Silence fell. The flames in the hearth dimmed, and from the walls of the council chamber, a sound emerged, soft at first, like wind through hollow reeds. Then louder, trembling, rising, until the stones themselves vibrated with it. A scream, not heard but felt. By morning, the old king was gone. Only a patch of scorched earth remained in his place, shaped like a crown. Back in Westreach, Aldrich began building. Not castles or roads, but altars. Strange structures carved into hillsides, made of bones and black stone. No two were the same, and none faced east. They all pointed toward Eldgrave. At each altar, Aldrich sat for hours, unmoving, the crown humming faintly, his fingers twitching as if conducting an invisible symphony. The people who lived nearby suffered dreams they could not wake from. Dreams of being watched from within their own skulls. Some awoke with bleeding eyes. Others never awoke at all. Yet no one fled. They stayed, as if their will had been softened, as if their thoughts no longer belonged to them. A priest dared approach him once. Anointed in the old god's oil, armed with relics said to ward off evil, he marched toward Aldrich during a twilight sermon. As he neared, the air thickened. Time slowed. Birds dropped from the sky mid-flight. He raised his relic, a shard of the dawn cross, blessed by 100 monks, and shouted, "Return to dust, cursed one." Aldrich turned his gaze toward the man. The crown shivered. The priest's mouth stretched unnaturally wide, wider than bone should allow, and from it poured a single, endless scream, not his own, but King Roderick's. His body collapsed into ash. The relic melted into the soil. And Aldrich said nothing. In the weeks that followed, a new language spread. Not spoken, but felt. People found themselves writing symbols they'd never learned. Walls bore markings that twisted when unobserved. Children hummed melodies that made grown men weep. Dreams became shared. The voice behind all of it was not Aldrich's. It was the crown. It no longer whispered. It directed. It remembered. And it used Aldrich's body to walk through the world it once ruled. Not everyone fell silent. In the distant north, among snow-covered peaks, a blind woman known only as Melis stirred from her stone crypt. She had been cursed with agelessness centuries before for defying King Roderick. They said her blood turned to ice the night she watched her family burn. She alone recognized the scream echoing across the land, and she alone could still resist it. She began the trek southward, carrying with her the blade that had once wounded Roderick himself, the blade he had cursed to never strike true again. But Melis had no intent to kill. She came to listen, for within the scream, she heard not only vengeance, she heard regret. Back in Westreach, Aldrich stood alone atop the altar of Black Hollow, beneath a moon that had turned red and hung lower than it should. He stared into the sky, his crown humming louder now, almost constant. The glow in his eyes pulsed in rhythm. His skin had paled. His voice, when spoken, echoed with Roderick's timbre. "The kings are returning," he said, "and I will be the one they wear." They called it the season of hollow cradles. It began with a single decree nailed to the trees of Westreach's borders, not written in ink, but in dried blood. Its letters were jagged, crude, and reeked of iron rot. There was no seal, no signature, only the command. Each village shall give one child to the crown before the next full moon. Refusal is treason. Silence is defiance. Defiance is sacrifice. No one believed it at first. No heralds came. No banners. No tacksmen with scrolls. Just silence and wind. But then came the knights. Dressed in armor black as coal and silent as dusk, they rode without sound, their horses pale and frothing, their eyes clouded white like beasts ridden too long by death itself. They spoke no words. They bore no emblems. But all knew whom they served. The crown. And the crown had begun to hunger. The first village to resist was Hearthmoor, a sleepy place nestled in the roots of the eastern cliffs. Its people were proud, old blood, descended from warriors who had once fought beneath the banner of King Roderick himself. When the knights came, they barred the roads, raised rusted pitchforks, and rang the iron bell in their chapel for the first time in 50 years. They thought courage would save them. By morning, the village was smoke. No bodies, no ashes, just broken doors, torn bedding, and a trail of small footprints in the dust leading toward the woods. All the children were gone, and from the empty chapel came a faint sound, a child's scream, repeating again and again, echoing against the stone with no voice to make it. They called it the blood tax. One child, every moon, taken in silence, with no warning, no names called, no preference shown, boys, girls, old enough to walk or young enough to still cry at the wind. It did not matter. The nights came without pattern. Some rode at dusk, others at dawn. Some took one child, others took two, claiming arrears owed from bloodlines past. The village elders tried to plead, to reason, to offer coin. The knights listened with heads tilted unnaturally to one side, as if curious about a language they could no longer understand. Then they took the child anyway. Rumors spread faster than the riders. In Blackfen, a widow threw herself onto a knight's horse, begging them to take her instead. The knight said nothing, simply placed his gauntlet on her face, and when he removed it, her mouth had vanished. She now wanders the roads, mumbling through her skin, holding the toy her son once carried. In Thornvale, they say a father followed the knights into the woods, tracking them for 3 nights through bramble and shadow. When he returned, he no longer had eyes, only holes, but in each socket, a reflection of the crown. He now weeps blood at the village edge, warning no one, yet seen by all. No one knows where the children go. No camps exist. No cells discovered. Only the screaming, faint and distant, drifting on the wind when the moon is high and swollen. Some say the crown feeds on innocence. Others whisper the truth, that the screams fuel its memory, that each child becomes another echo added to King Roderick's eternal howl. The crown does not kill them. It remembers them. Aldrich never addressed the tax. He did not stand in halls or speak to the grieving. He did not justify the taking. But wherever a child vanished, his presence soon followed. A shadow on the hilltop, watching from afar, the crown faintly glowing above him. His eyes no longer held color, only red light. Some say they flickered with each scream, as though feeding, as though counting. Temples began to crumble. The priests, once pillars of hope, now wandered confused and broken. Their gods did not answer prayers anymore. Fires in sacred braziers would not light. Holy water turned black. Sacred scrolls bled ink, twisting words into blasphemy. One priest, desperate, climbed the cliffs of Barrow's End and called upon the old gods with his final breath. The wind did not carry his voice, but it did return his scream, tenfold, echoing through the valley for 3 days before fading into weeping. The people stopped praying. The gods had gone silent. Desperation birthed madness. Villages began to hide their children, burying them beneath floorboards, sending them to wander alone through the woods. But the knights always found them. Boys. One girl, hidden beneath a hearth, survived for 5 days until the stones themselves cracked, her name carved into the walls by an unseen hand. The next morning, the family found her gone, the hearth now cold for the first time in a century. The villagers began breaking their own children's legs, thinking the knights sought strength. They came anyway, and they took the broken ones first. An old woman from the north remembered an old rite, a binding spell cast in blood and song that could mask a child from spirits. The villagers of Cairns Hollow tried it. They danced around their children, sang until their voices failed, bled from their palms onto the earth. And it worked. For one night. The next evening, the knights arrived. They did not take the children. They took the singers. And the children woke screaming in unison, their mouths speaking the same name they had never been taught. Roderick. What few nobles remained dared to speak in secret. They gathered in forgotten cellars, drinking vinegar instead of wine, terrified to toast lest their voices betray them. One baron suggested rallying arms, forming a new alliance to resist Aldrich. He vanished before the night ended. In his place sat a note written in bone dust. The tax must be paid, or the earth will scream in your stead. No one spoke again. The land itself began to change. Rivers ran slower. Trees grew twisted, their bark marked with screaming faces only visible at night. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight. Fields sprouted crops shaped like teeth. The blood taken from the villages had not vanished. It had been planted, and now the land was growing sorrow. Those who tried to escape found the roads always led them back. One family traveled east for 9 days, marking trees with ash and stone, believing they'd made it beyond Aldrich's reach. On the 10th day, they arrived at a village they did not recognize, until they saw their own home empty, untouched as if they had never left. They found themselves standing where they began. Their child was gone. The whispers returned, this time in dreams shared by many. Dreams where they stood in a field of screaming children, each face blurred, each voice crying in perfect unison. At the center stood the crown not worn, but floating, turning slowly, shedding sparks that burned the dreamer's skin even after waking. They say one man tried to tear his ears out to stop hearing it. They say he now hears it louder. The blood tax continued. Villages now offered children without resistance, dressing them in their finest, brushing their hair, whispering lies about returning home. The knights came, took them, and the parents returned to silence. No one wept anymore. Tears no longer came. Only blood. From bitten tongues. From clenched jaws. From broken teeth ground down in grief. Aldrich watched it all from the throne carved from the remains of Eldgrave's altar. He never moved, never spoke. But the crown did. Its hum was now constant, a song of torment. And it grew louder with each child taken. It fed not on their flesh, but on the sound of those who remained. Their silence. Their madness, their surrender. The gods had gone. Hope had fled. And still the scream echoed. Unseen, unending, undeniable. And the crown once worn by kings now wore the world. Her name was Elena of Rinholm. The people of her village called her the Quiet Widow, the healer, the woman with ash in her hair and iron in her spine. They whispered that grief had turned her strange, that she walked barefoot in frost and spoke to the moon. But they never dared mock her. Her son had been taken. The first. He was 6. His name was Joran. He loved apples, crows, and old songs. One night, the Black Knights came. No words, no warning, just the hush of hooves and the sound of a door opening. Elena awoke to silence and the smell of burned milk. Joran's bed was empty. A single feather, dark, oily, lay on the blanket. She did not scream. She did not beg. She waited until the moon waned, then crept into her son's room with a needle and his tunic. With threads soaked in her blood, she stitched the garment into the shape of a wolf's head. She carved bone from her own ribs to form the jaw. She shaped the ears from Joran's old satchel. When it was done, she wore the mask over her face and burned her home to the ground. No one stopped her. They only watched as she walked into the forest barefoot, singing the lullaby Joran used to hum in his sleep. Elena followed the knights for days. She moved like a shadow. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She watched them ride across rivers without leaving ripples. She watched birds fall from the sky at their approach. She watched villagers fall to their knees and offer children wrapped in silence. She said nothing, but she remembered. The wolves began to follow her. Not in packs, but alone, one at a time. Starved. Yet when they stood beside her, they stood tall. They did not howl. They growled low, guttural sounds, like drums made of flesh. Wherever Elena walked, the trees parted. The wind quieted. The mask whispered to her now. Not with words, but with knowing. It pulled her forward, and it led her to Eldgrave. The keep rose like a broken fong from the mouth of the valley. Its stones were slick with moss. Its towers bent backward, twisted by centuries of rage. No guards stood at its gates. No banners waved, but every window glowed with faint red light. And from beneath it, the scream. Elena knelt at the edge of the valley. The wolves sat behind her, watching. And she whispered, "I am coming, Joran." Then she walked. No one had entered Eldgrave since Aldrich's coronation. Many had tried. Knights with hearts full of faith. Mages with blood-bound scrolls. Thieves drawn by rumors of relics buried in the crypts. All had failed. Most had disappeared. The few who returned came back with eyes white as bone and mouths that only echoed with the crown's scream. Elena did not come with weapons. She came with a mask, and it listened. As she neared the broken outer wall, the earth trembled. The air thickened, heavy with iron and memory. The scream rose from the keep like steam from boiling blood. But it did not touch her. It parted, letting her through. Inside, the keep was not empty. It breathed. Walls shifted when unobserved. Torches flickered with no flame. Stairs rose where none had stood. Eldgrave was alive, not with life, but with memory. A place carved from a curse and shaped by screams. Elena walked without hesitation. The mask guided her. She reached the great hall where once kings had fallen, where Roderick had cursed the bloodline of traitors. The throne was gone. In its place stood a black altar carved from melted swords, and above it, a crown floated, not placed, not held, but suspended in agony. It turned slowly. She did not look at it. She listened. The whispers in the walls shifted, soft at first, then frantic, angry, curious. But when they reached her, they softened. They surrounded her like breath against her skin. They did not scream. They whispered one word. "Mother." Beneath the altar, the stone trembled. The floor cracked in a perfect spiral. Dust rose. Elena stepped forward and placed her hand on the altar. The mask pulsed. The floor opened. A stairway of bone. She descended. The passage beneath Eldgrave was not built. It had grown. The walls were veins. The ceiling wept condensation that smelled of salt and ash. At the bottom was a chamber, round and echoless, where 10 swords floated in a ring, dripping blood that vanished before it touched the floor. And in the center, a pool of shadow. Not water, not oil, but something older, something waiting. Elena stepped forward. The mask fell from her face. She knelt beside the pool and whispered her son's name. The darkness shivered, and from its depths a shape emerged. Well, fragile, familiar, a child's hand, but not Yoren. Many hands, too many, dozens, hundreds, all reaching, all grasping, all mouthing the same word. Home. Elena did not scream. She reached into the pool, and it accepted her. The chamber trembled. The swords shrieked. But the pool did not devour her. It listened. The whispers that had once broken the minds of kings now flowed into her. They showed her memories, not hers, but the crown's. The forging, the betrayal, the curse, the hunger, the children, the suffering, and one face at the center of it all. Not Aldrich, not even Roderick, but the blacksmith, Kirk, still alive, trapped, not in the world, but in the crown. And from him, the crown had learned love, and used it to sharpen hate. Elena rose. The hands receded. The chamber grew silent. The swords dropped, inert. She took the mask and placed it back upon her face. But it was no longer just a mask. It was her son's memory, and it whispered not with grief, but with purpose. She turned toward the stairs, and the passage opened for her. Back in the hall, the crown still floated, but it no longer turned. It faced her, waiting, and from behind the altar, Aldrich stepped into view. His face was pale. His eyes bled light. His voice was Roderick's. "You should not be here." Elena said nothing. The mask spoke for her. "I was always meant to be." The crown screamed. The walls cracked. But the scream did not hurt her. It bent around her. Aldrich raised his hand, a gesture meant to break minds. Elena raised her voice. "He forged it. You wore it. But I will end it." The scream turned to silence. The air thickened, and the crown descended, slowly, gently, toward her head. She did not move. She let it touch her, and when it did, it screamed again. But this time, it screamed her name. The deeper Elena walked into Eldgrave, the less the stone resembled stone. The walls no longer bore the smooth texture of chisels or mortar. They pulsed faintly, like skin stretched thin over unseen veins. The air held a taste, not of dust or age, but marrow. She had descended beneath the keep through a mouth shaped like a staircase, guided by silence. The wolves who had once followed her now lingered at the entrance, refusing to step where the air no longer belonged to the living. But she went anyway, her mask still firm upon her face, the whisper of her son's memory carrying her forward. The crown had touched her, and yet she had not broken. Now, it watched from above, silent again, waiting. The corridor narrowed and twisted, more like a route than a passage, until it opened into a vast chamber with no roof. The sky was gone. No stars, no moon, Only blackness above, endless and silent. And in the center stood the throne. It did not sit on a dais or atop steps carved by man. It had grown from the ground like a great tumor, a tangle of roots, bones, iron, and flesh fused together into something vaguely throne-shaped, but too jagged, too alive. It breathed, not in rhythm but in gasps, like something dying slowly or being born forever. Elena approached. She stepped carefully over vines made of knotted ribs. The roots beneath her feet cracked, leaking a fluid that hissed like steam and stung her skin. The closer she got, the louder it became, not sound, but sensation. A pressure in her head, the beating of ancient thoughts trying to get in. The throne remembered, not just who had sat upon it, but who it had devoured. And it had devoured many. Behind the throne stood a shelf carved from spine-shaped stone. Upon it, nestled between jars filled with shadowed liquids and broken quills, sat a single book, bound in black leather, etched with a symbol shaped like a screaming mouth. She reached for it. The journal opened without resistance. The pages turned in a windless room, flipping through entries old as dust. The ink had faded to a rust-red color. Some pages were blank. Others bore symbols in languages that clawed at her mind, trying to be understood. But there were words she recognized, written in a jagged, confident hand. Roderick. It was his journal. She read, not as one schemes for answers, but as one listens to confessions carved into skin. He had not begun as a tyrant. He had ruled with fire, yes, but not cruelty. He had sought unity, had loved once, lost often, feared what every king fears in silence, time. And so, in his desperation to hold his kingdom together as rot bloomed in its corners, he had made a pact, not with demons, not with gods, but with something older, something beneath. The journal called it the root beneath iron. A hunger buried under the mountain long before Eldgrave had been built, long before men knew words. He wrote of whispers, of dreams, of a voice that called him down, 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 where he found a seed of iron and bone, pulsing in the dark. It promised power, permanence, memory eternal. He fed it blood, and it grew. She turned the page. The script faltered here, the ink thicker, the lines frantic. He wrote of the throne's first breath, of how it pulsed when he sat upon it, how it began to guide his hand, to shape his judgments. He wrote of how it remembered every lie spoken in its shadow, how it punished betrayal before it was even confessed. He called it a gift. He called it justice. But then came the crown. It was not forged above. It was grown below, shaped from the same root that made the throne. A ring of living metal, forged by betrayal, fed by memory. He placed it upon his head only once, and the screaming began. The journal's handwriting unraveled after that. Sentences broke. Words collapsed into symbols. He wrote as if in a trance, sometimes backward, sometimes in languages he swore never to speak. But the meaning bled through the page. He could not remove the crown. He could not sleep. He forgot his name. He began hearing the voices of the dead, not as ghosts, but as thoughts inside his own skull. His wife's laughter twisted into sobbing. His son's last breath repeating endlessly. And through it all, the crown's command. Feed. He fed it war. He fed it betrayal. And when the blood of enemies no longer sated it, he fed it the blood of friends. The throne grew stronger. The root deepened. The keep began to change. Then came the final page. It was torn halfway, the ink blotched by something thick and dark. The last line read, "The crown feeds." And then nothing. No signature. No date. Just a smear, as though the writer had been torn away mid-sentence. Elena closed the journal. The chamber felt colder now. The throne, still heaving in silence, seemed to lean toward her. She stepped closer. At its base, where roots split to form the seat, she saw them. Faces. Carved in agony. Eyes open. Mouths forever screaming. Some she recognized from village carvings. Ancient kings. Fallen lords. Even priests and poets. All who had worn the crown. Not buried. Absorbed. The throne was not a seat. It was a graveyard. And Roderick's was the face at the center, eyes wide, lips trembling, eternally mouthing the word. Why? Elena fell to her knees, not in defeat, but in knowing. She understood now what the crown was, not a symbol of rule, but a prison for memory, a curse that bled through bloodlines and devoured not just minds, but meaning. It had fed on Roderick, on Eldrick, on children, on prayers, on screams, and now it watched her. But she did not scream. She whispered, "I see you." And the chamber shook. The roots pulled tighter around the throne. The ground cracked. A tremor ran through the keep above, toppling rotting stones and shaking broken towers. The journal caught flame, without fire, and turned to ash in her hands. But she did not move. The mask upon her face pulsed, and behind her, the faint echo of a child's laugh drifted through the chamber. Not a scream, not a cry. A laugh. Urin's laugh. The throne recoiled. The root beneath it cracked. And for the first time since it was grown, it groaned, not in hunger, but in pain. Elena stood. She reached toward the center of the throne, where the faces writhed. And she touched Roderick's cheek. The stone turned warm and wet. The tear fell. The first, the only. The chamber screamed, but not in anger, in mourning. And the scream echoed through the mountain, up through the halls, into the sky, a sound not of power or pain, but of something ancient being undone. The crown, far above, cracked, a single fracture down its center, but spreading. And deep below, in the hollow heart of Eldgrave, the throne began to wither. The roots curled inward, the bones crumbled, the metal wept, and Elena whispered one word: enough. They called it the throne rot. It began quietly, a strange fever, a bit of skin that wouldn't heal, lips cracking where no cold wind had passed, eyes watering in red threads like veins unraveling. At first, the symptoms seemed like any other affliction carried through blood and bone. But these were not common men. These were Aldrich's knights, his most loyal, those who rode beside him as he conquered without sword, as he ruled without mercy. They had worn the black iron. They had answered the scream. And now they were being unmade. The first case emerged in the western outpost of Halden's Spire. A young knight named Corwin collapsed mid-sentence during a midnight patrol. He stood frozen, eyes wide, lips murmuring something too faint to hear. When they carried him into the keep, his tongue had turned black and split into two like a serpent's. They buried him that night, but by morning, the grave was empty. Only his armor remained, curled inward, like it had tried to eat itself. Within weeks, it spread. Not like fire, but like whisper. One by one, the knights began to change. Skin flaked off in patches, revealing sinew underneath that pulsed to no heartbeat. Their nails thickened, curled like claws. Their breath smelled of rust and wet earth. But worst were their eyes. They wept constantly, and the tears were red. Not from injury, from memory. They did not cry in pain. They cried in silence, as though remembering something not theirs. They'd be seen standing in fields, whispering old lullabies they had never been taught. Some muttered names that hadn't existed for centuries. One spoke only in screams, never stopping, never resting, even in sleep. But they still served, even as their bodies rotted, even as their flesh turned gray and cracked like burnt wood. They obeyed Aldrich's every command, without question, without hesitation, as if the crown had replaced their thoughts with chains. A healer named Thalen of Marecross was the first to study them. He had once cured kings, delivered noblewomen from death's grip, and tamed plagues with herbs alone. He came to Eldgrave upon hearing of the illness, thinking it a curse or disease. But when he opened the flesh of one afflicted knight, he found something else. Not sickness, memory. The skin bled images, faint, fleeting, but clear. Scenes played across the blood like visions in smoke. He saw battlefields the knight had never fought in. Voices from before time began. A scream that looped endlessly in the marrow. The rot, he realized, wasn't physical. It was historical. A curse made flesh. He called it the throne rot. And he warned the court, they are not infected. They are becoming echoes. They dismissed him. 2 nights later, he vanished. They found his journals scattered across the floor. Pages torn. Scratches carved into the wall with fingernails. One final line smeared across the stone in blood. The crown remembers through us. The afflicted knights no longer needed sleep. Their wounds never closed. When stabbed, they did not bleed, they oozed shadow. Some began to hum in their sleep, and the melody matched the scream of the crown. They could not die. Not properly. One was beheaded after losing control during a patrol. His head continued whispering long after it hit the floor. They buried it in 6 graves. It was found sitting beside Aldrich's throne the next morning, smiling. Aldrich said nothing. He never addressed the rot. He simply watched as it consumed his army. And the crown pulsed brighter. Its hum could now be heard through stone, through soil, through skin. Mothers miscarried at the sound. Dogs howled in rhythm. Trees in nearby forests began bleeding sap that stained the ground with faces. In a quiet village to the east, a former knight, Sir Dane, who had once sworn fealty to Aldrich before defecting, began showing signs. Though he had cast off his armor years ago, though he lived alone and silent, the rot found him. He awoke one morning with his eyes bleeding. He wrote a single sentence into the dirt outside his cabin. "You cannot run from memory." Then he walked into the river and did not return. The rot spread faster now. Not just among knights, but to scribes who touched cursed scrolls, cooks who prepared meals near Aldrich's court, stable hands who brushed the horses ridden by the cursed. It no longer needed loyalty, only proximity. And still, no one left. Those afflicted felt drawn toward Eldgrave. As if summoned, they did not resist. They walked for days, skin peeling, voices rasping. Some crawled. Some floated in nightmares. All arrived kneeling. All wept blood. Elena watched from the shadows. She had not fled the throne room since the journal burned in her hands. She remained beneath Eldgrave, hidden behind ancient walls that bent inward like the ribs of a dying god. She watched the rot swell. And she listened. The whispers changed. They were no longer only Roderick. She heard Aldrich now. Faint, confused, afraid. His thoughts bled through the walls like mold through wet wood. He could not control them anymore. The rot had turned inward. One night, she entered the upper chamber again. The cursed knights stood still in the great hall, heads bowed, unmoving. Their armor cracked. Their faces gone. Elena walked between them, and none stopped her. They sensed her now, not as threat, not as queen, but as memory. She was no longer a stranger. She was part of the scream. Aldrich sat slumped on the iron altar. He did not look up. The crown still rested upon his head, but its glow was weaker, flickering. He spoke barely. "I remember too much." His voice cracked. "I remember wars I never fought. Lovers I never knew. Children I never held. Screams I never made." She approached. The rot had reached him too. His fingers trembled. His skin peeled in silent strips. His chest pulsed with veins that spelled runes in every language ever buried. And from his mouth leaked not words, but whispers. Different every moment. They spilled from him like smoke. "I thought I ruled it. But I am only a mirror. It wears me." Elena knelt before him. She did not remove the crown. She placed her hand on his chest. And for the first time in centuries, Aldrich wept. Not blood. Not memory. Tears. Behind her, the cursed knights dropped to the ground, not dead, but quiet. Their eyes closed, their bodies still, as if memory had released them. The crown screamed again, but this scream was sharp, like a blade snapping. Cracked, splintered, wounded. It glowed, then flickered, then dimmed. The throne rot paused, held its breath. Elena whispered, "You do not get to remember forever." And the walls trembled. Aldrich smiled. It was the smile of a man unshackled. Then he collapsed. The crown rolled from his head. It did not scream. It sighed, and the rot stopped spreading. But it did not die. It slept, waiting for another memory to feed, another voice to echo, another scream to wear. The chapel was nothing but bones. Once, it had been the pride of the Highlands, a cathedral carved from white marble, crowned with silver bells said to toll at the birth of kings and the fall of tyrants. Now it lay in ruins. The bell tower had collapsed inward like a mouth swallowing itself, and the altar was a shattered slab coated in moss and dried lichen. No prayers echoed here. No gods lingered. Only dust. And secrets. Elena arrived in silence. The wolves no longer followed her. They had vanished into the wind after the crown cracked and Aldrich fell. Eldgrave still pulsed behind her, but the scream had quieted. The land was not healed, only holding its breath. She had followed whispers in dreams. A voice not like Roderick's or Aldrich's, but older, fainter, a murmur lost in wind, guiding her to the broken chapel at the edge of the hollow moor. There, the bell remained, but it no longer rang. It wept. She stepped through what was once the great arch, the doors long devoured by rot. The air tasted of salt and soot, and the ground was scattered with feathers, not from birds, but larger, darker, brittle as ash. At the center of the chapel, where once saints had stood, knelt a figure wrapped in robes the color of old blood. The robe was stitched with thread made from hair. Human hair. He did not turn as she entered. He simply said, "The wolf comes at last." More emerged from the shadows. A dozen figures, all robed, all silent. They moved like memories. Their faces were covered in masks, some iron, some wood, some carved from bone. No two were alike, yet each bore the symbol of a bell, inverted, crossed by a single blade. They were not warriors, not priests. They were something in between, remnants of an oath older than kingdoms. The man at the center stood. His mask was gold, but tarnished, cracked at the temple. "We are the Order of the Morning Bell," he said. "We toll only for the cursed." They had waited for her, not because she was chosen, because she had survived. They had seen the scream enter her, and not destroy her. They had seen her walk the bone stairs beneath Eldgrave. They had seen the mask she wore, not forged, but born from grief. They welcomed her not as savior, but as witness. The gold-masked one spoke again. "You know of the crown, but do you know what it was before?" She said nothing, only listened. He stepped closer and unrolled a cloth upon the broken altar. Within it lay 10 small shards of metal, each humming faintly, each blackened beyond recognition. Together, they formed a broken circle, not a crown, but the memory of one. He gestured to them, voice dropping. 10 blades, 10 betrayals, 10 souls. He pointed to each shard. One slit the throat of his brother in exchange for land. One led his people into slavery for silver. One poisoned a well to win a woman's love. One burned his own village to earn the favor of a king. The stories continued. Each shard held a tale darker than the last. Each had once been a sword wielded by a traitor so foul, so wretched, that death refused them. Their souls had clung to the steel like mold. When Eric the blacksmith began his cursed work, he did not forge from iron alone. He melted these 10 blades, and the souls screamed as they fused. The gold-masked man looked up. That is why the crown screams. It is not one curse. It is 10. And each soul inside it remembers every sin it committed and all it learned afterward. It is no relic of rule. It is a monument of guilt. Elena asked how they knew. He answered by lifting his sleeve. Beneath the robe, his skin was etched with names, not tattooed, but carved. Each scar was fresh. The ink was blood. "We remember them," he said, "so they don't remember us." The order had waited centuries. They did not fight. They did not chant. They watched, listened, recorded. Every time the crown resurfaced, they gathered. Every scream, every vision, every rot-sick night, they wrote it all. But they had failed, because the scream always returned. Each time louder, each time smarter. One among them stepped forward. Her mask was carved from bone, shaped like the skull of a child. She held out a book wrapped in pale leather. No title. "This belonged to Eric," she said. Elena opened it. The pages were chaos. Drawings of teeth. Schematics of impossible shapes. maps that led nowhere. But in the center was a sketch, rough but clear. A blade. Unlike any sword, it was curved inward, hollow, meant not to cut, but to contain. A blade that could sever memory. Eric had tried to forge it. He had failed. He wrote that the crown could only be unmade by the same tools that made it, but turned against themselves. 10 souls, 10 betrayals, 10 blades reforged as one. Not to kill, but to imprison. He called it the Silent Fong. The Order had searched for it for generations. But the materials had scattered. The 10 swords were melted, yes, but fragments remained. Hiding, waiting. One lay in the river beneath Rinholm. One embedded in the ribcage of a saint buried upside down. One inside a song no one remembered how to sing. The Order had found 7. They needed 10. And the final 3, they said, had fused into the crown itself. They looked to Elena, not for strength, but for suffering. She was the only one who had heard all 10 voices and remained whole. The mask had shielded her, yes, but her grief had anchored her. She had not worn the crown, yet she bore its weight. She was the last vessel the blade needed. To forge the Silent Fong, the Order would have to draw the scream from her, not rip it, but coax it like poison from a wound. If it worked, the scream would lose its anchor. It would unravel. The crown would collapse under its own memory. But the risk was total. If it failed, the scream would not just destroy her. It would become her. She agreed. Not out of courage, but because she could still hear Yoren in the dark, calling her, and not calling for help, calling for silence. The Order prepared the forge, not of flame, but of sound. The morning bell, long dormant, was lifted again. They struck it once, not with hammer, but with bone. And the sound that rang was not loud. It was final. The chamber cracked. The shards trembled. And Elena fell to her knees. From her mouth, not a word, but a wind. A scream of screams. 10 voices layered atop one another. Crying, laughing, begging, commanding. Each pouring from her in waves. And the shards began to glow. The gold-masked one chanted. The Order knelt. The chapel wept blood from its walls. But the scream did not resist. It wanted release. It had remembered too long. It was tired, and when the 10th shard lit, the bell rang again. Then shattered. The chamber fell silent. Elena collapsed. The Order rose. In their hands, the blade. Forged from guilt. Hollow. Perfect. Still, they did not cheer. They did not pray. They wrapped the blade in linen, placed it in a chest made from the bones of their ancestors, and sealed it in salt. And then they looked to Elena, still breathing, but no longer listening. The scream was gone, and for the first time in centuries, there was only silence. Eldgrave was never meant to last. The keep had been raised atop the oldest wound in the world, a place where memory bled and stone remembered every betrayal laid upon it. Its foundations had been cursed long before Roderick sat the throne, long before Eric touched steel, long before Aldrich's eyes began glowing with the color of lost suns. The keep stood not on earth, but on regret. And now, it could no longer hold what had been buried. The crown had cracked. The scream had been pulled through Elena like a ghost escaping the mouth of time. The Silent Fong had been forged, hidden in bone and salt. The Order of the Morning Bell had scattered, vanishing like smoke after a holy fire. And the keep began to bleed. It started as a trickle. Thin red lines appeared on the stone walls, streaks like condensation, running downward from the ceiling to the floor in trembling paths. The servants thought it was water tainted with rust. The guards blamed mold, but the dogs howled. The birds fled. And then came the scent, copper and smoke, the unmistakable reek of open wounds. It coated the air. It stuck to the tongue. No one could breathe without tasting iron. And then the walls began to whisper. Not words, not screams, shuddering, ragged breaths. By the third night, the entire keep wept. Every corridor, every staircase, every chamber. Blood flowed from the cracks, from between the stones, from places no eye had seen in centuries. The throne room flooded ankle-deep, and still it poured, slow, steady, patient. The keep bled like a heart still beating after death. And Aldrich remained. He had not spoken in days. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He sat in the high tower, the crown still fastened to his skull, sunken deep into his skin. It no longer sat upon his brow, it had grown into him, fused with bone, drinking from his mind like a parasite too familiar to be removed. His eyes glowed brighter now, not red, but silver-streaked with ash. And he spoke, not in his voice, not in any known tongue, but in ancient syllables, sharp, jagged sounds that cracked glass and killed insects mid-flight. Words that hadn't been spoken aloud since the first betrayal, the first scream, the first sword carved from memory. His voice shattered mirrors. His breath extinguished flames. He was becoming more than man, and less. The servants fled. Those who tried to leave through the gates found the road twisted. Trees bent to block their path. Fog thickened into walls. One knight claimed he walked for hours, only to arrive back at the keep stable door. They were trapped. Inside a body that bled. Inside a mind that remembered. The walls began to speak names, carved in blood that dried instantly, as though seared into the stone by unseen hands. The names stretched across the halls, down staircases, over windows. Thousands, each one written in a different script. Names of the dead, names of the forgotten, names of those the crown had touched, and one name repeated more than any other: Elena. In the crypts below, the dead stirred. The tombs cracked, bones twisted. Sarcophagi wept blood onto their own inscriptions. The ghosts of kings whose names had been buried with fire began walking in circles, muttering curses they had sworn never to speak again. The keep no longer obeyed time. It was unmoored. Memories collided. Reality bent. And at the center of it all, Aldrich, possessed by 1,000 voices, speaking truths no mortal should understand. He stood one evening in the great hall, surrounded by his rotting knights, those still able to kneel despite their crumbling limbs. He raised his hand, and they lifted their heads. He spoke. The words did not echo. They sunk into the air like claws into flesh, and the walls screamed back. Not in pain, in understanding. The keep was alive now, and it was listening. One servant remained, a girl named Liz, no older than 16. She had been born in the keep's kitchens, never stepped beyond its walls. She had grown up hearing the stones speak in her dreams, had watched rats drag prayers into the cracks between tiles. She did not run. She followed the blood. She wandered the keep like a ghost among ghosts, touching the words on the walls, listening to them hum beneath her fingertips. The walls knew her, and they led her to the tower. To him. Aldrich did not turn as she entered. She bowed her head. She did not speak. The crown twitched. A whisper poured from his mouth, a riddle in a tongue that hadn't been born yet. She understood it, and whispered back, "It is not your crown." His breath stopped, turned, and for the first time since the crack in the crown, Aldrich's eyes flickered. Just for a second, they turned human. Liz placed a hand on the wall beside her. It bled. She did not flinch. She said, "You are bleeding because you remember. But you cannot stop. Because you are the scream. And the scream is not finished." Aldrich opened his mouth, but it was not his voice. It was Roderick's. "She's inside." Then Eric's. "I built her." Then Yoren's. "She wears the mask." And then Elena's. And it. Aldrich fell to his knees. The knights behind him crumbled. Their armor folded inward. The tower shook. Blood poured from the ceiling. The crown hissed, and then it cracked further. The break spread. A sound like 1,000 teeth snapping echoed through the air. The keep wailed, not screamed, wailed, like something old enough to mourn. In the eastern wall, a hole opened. A pulse of breath escaped it, hot, fetid, and thick with memory. And a whisper. One word, not in any tongue, just meaning. Now. Liz left the tower. She followed the blood, and the keep opened for her. A door no one had ever seen before revealed a stairway of bone and root, leading deeper than the crypts, past even the screaming chamber, into a place beneath places. Where the scream was born, the walls bled, but not in rage, in release. And above, in the tower, Aldrich sat alone. The crown now cracked, his body still, his eyes wide, and a single tear, just one, ran down his cheek. Not blood, not shadow, just water, a memory of grief, a memory of something human. The keep kept bleeding, but the blood had changed. It no longer flowed from wounds. It flowed from memory, from stories, from names. Each drop a scream no longer needed. Each streak a ghost finally laid to rest. Eldgrave was breaking, not from battle, but from release. The stones were tired. The blood had wept long enough. And below, something was stirring. Not evil, not holy, just final. Elena felt it wherever she was. So did the wolves in the woods. So did the bells buried beneath the ruined chapel. The scream had not ended, but it had changed. It had softened. It had remembered what it once was. A warning and a psalm. But the crown had not yet shattered, and it never would, until the scream sang its final name. The blood moon rose over Eldgrave like an opened wound. It bathed the keep in red light, painting the towers like bones soaked in war. The sky was cloudless. The wind did not move. Not even the wolves howled. It was the night of feasting. It had always been this way, once every 13 years, when the moon turned crimson and the veil between memory and matter thinned, the king was to feast. Not with lords or nobles, but with the dead, with the remembered, with the betrayed. But this time, the feast would be different, because Elena had returned, and she had not come alone. The order of the morning bell had remained in the shadows since the forging of the silent Fong. They had scattered, yes, but they had not vanished. Their masks were hidden in the soil, their books buried beneath ruins, their oaths etched into the bones of forgotten saints. Now they gathered again, not to record, but to end. The keep's gates opened by themselves. The blood that once flowed from the walls had dried into long, winding scars, like the veins of a dying beast. The torches lit themselves without flame. The throne room was dressed in wrought and velvet, crowned with a chandelier made of swords bent by screams. And at the center of it all sat Aldrich, motionless. The iron ring still fused to his skull, now splintered down the center like a cracked halo. His eyes remained half open. His hands rested on a table of stone, set with silver dishes filled with ash and bone. The air around him shimmered, not with magic, but with memory too heavy to bear. He had not moved in days, but his breath still carried words no one had spoken in 1,000 years. The scream had made its king, and now the king would feast. Elena moved through the shadows in silence. Her mask, shaped from the memory of her son, pulsed faintly beneath her hood. She wore no armor, only grief. Around her, the order crept like wind through a graveyard. 12 figures, 12 blades, 12 voices sworn to silence until the final scream. And among them, the blade, the silent Fong, curved, hollow, forged from 10 betrayals and one purpose. It had never been drawn. Until tonight, the guests gathered around the king's table were not alive. They moved, they raised goblets. They laughed in voices stretched by memory. But their eyes were wrong. Too empty, too old. They were the souls the crown had devoured, given shape for the feast. And they watched. They knew what was coming, but they did not care. Because nothing mattered to the remembered, only the scream. The signal was simple. When the bell, the broken one in the courtyard, rang once. Just once. Not from rope, but from silence breaking. Elena took her place among the servers, her hands steady despite the weight of history pressing down upon her. The king did not look at her. He stared forward, unmoving, eyes fixed on the red moon outside. The orders spread through the hall. One behind the throne, one beside the table, one beneath the floorboards where the old blood still whispered, and one, the youngest, nameless, cradled the blade wrapped in cloth. When the moment came, it was soundless. The bell did not ring with steel. It rang with breath, a single exhale, and the assassin moved. He was the best of them, swift, unseen, mask of obsidian, blade in hand before anyone drew breath. He leapt over the table, soared through dust and silence, and brought the silent Fong down upon Aldrich's head with a cry born from centuries of waiting. The blade touched the crown, and shattered, not the crown, the blade. The silent Fong, unmaker of memory, snapped in midair like a twig burned from within. It screamed as it died, a high-pitched wail that echoed in all directions. And then the assassin did not fall. He crumbled, not bled, crumbled. His body turned to dust mid-strike. Bones first, then flesh, then cloth, the mask, and where he stood, only a pile of bone-white ash remained, smoldering in the shape of a man who had believed. The room froze. The remembered guests stopped moving. Elena did not breathe, and Aldrich stood. For the first time in a month, he stood. His eyes opened fully, and they were empty. No glow, no flame, just void. He turned toward the pile of ash and spoke. Memory cannot be killed. His voice was a whisper of thunder, a contradiction. Then he looked to Elena, not with anger, but with sadness. You heard it, and still you tried to silence it. Do you know what happens when you strike a scream? The room answered for him. Crack. The stones split. The walls screamed. Blood, fresh, hot, and wrong, erupted from the cracks like fountains. The table flipped, and the remembered guests screamed as their flesh peeled back to reveal the sins they had died with. One wept children. Another vomited coins. A third melted into ink and scrawled prayers across the floor. The crown on Aldrich's head glowed bright. Not red, not silver, but white. Pure scream. The order fell to their knees. Masks shattered. One by one, their hands covered their ears. Not from the sound, but from the memory now rushing into them. The blade's death had unbounded. They were no longer witnesses. They were vessels. And they remembered everything the crown had ever held. Elena stood. She alone did not fall. She stepped toward Aldrich. The ash clung to her boots, and she said, "You are not the scream. You are its echo, and echoes fade." Aldrich raised his hand. The crown cracked further, but no power came, only weeping, not his, hers. Elena fell to her knees, clutching her mask. Urin's voice spilled from it. So faint. It's time, mother. Let go. The scream inside the crown surged. One final time. A flood of voices. A symphony of sorrow. Roderick. Kirk. The children. The kings. The broken. The burned. They all screamed through the crown. And the crown screamed back. But this time, it did not break anyone. It broke itself. A crack split from one end to the other. Then another. Then a third. And then the crown fell. Not in defeat, but in release. It struck the stone floor and shattered into 10 pieces, each one shaped like a blade. The original swords, the 10 betrayals, returned to the world. No longer fused, no longer fed. Aldrich fell with it, but he did not shatter. He breathed, one long breath, then closed his eyes. The feast ended. The moon faded. The guests turned to ash. The remembered returned to memory. And the scream went quiet. For the first time since iron touched bone. Silence. The keep did not collapse. It sighed, and then it rested. Elena walked alone from Eldgrave. She carried nothing, not even the mask. Behind her, the morning bell tolled. Just once, and then never again. The crown had shattered. The silent Fong had failed. The feast had ended in ash and silence. Eldgrave no longer screamed, but the stillness that followed was worse. Because the scream was not gone. It was waiting. It had never wanted to be destroyed. It had wanted to be understood. And now that it had been touched, cracked, whispered to, resisted, it evolved. The crown was no longer one voice. It was 10. And now it hungered. The 10 shards lay scattered across the land. Each piece no larger than a broken tooth, yet each carried within it the weight of betrayal, the rot of memory, the thirst of kings. They should have been buried. They should have been sealed in salt and stone, cast into the sea or buried in the sunless deserts. But the order had been broken. Their sanctuaries burned, their oaths silenced, and Aldrich, though quiet and collapsed, still breathed. One shard remained near him, embedded in the floor where the crown had cracked open. A knight retrieved it, not a man of renown, nor one born of noble blood. Just a name lost among many, Ser Brannock. He picked up the shard not out of greed, but of compulsion. A whisper had curled through the stone, calling him by name in a voice that sounded like his own. He touched the piece, and it answered. The change was not immediate. His hands blackened at the fingertips, the veins up his arms turning gray like spiderwebs made of ash. He wore gloves to hide it. His dreams twisted. He spoke less. His blade grew heavier, but so did his strength. And when Aldrich awoke, wordless, hollow-eyed, Brannock was there, waiting, and the shard pulsed in his chest. The crown had shattered, but its hunger had not. Aldrich no longer sat on a throne. He wandered, through ruined villages, through forests that bled from the trees, through graveyards where bones rose in protest and lay back down in shame. The lands once ruled by the Order, those hidden sanctuaries where the scream had once been bound, he sought them one by one. And he razed them, not with armies, with silence. Villages fell without battle. Wells curdled, milk turned to worms. Children began weeping songs in languages their parents could not bear to hear. The first was called Drybridge, a place of bells and healers. The villagers woke to find their livestock dead, their walls painted with their own dreams. No attacker was seen, just shadows circling in the night, and a figure, a knight, speaking to something only he could hear. By morning, every man, woman, and child had disappeared. Only a hole remained, perfectly round, the shape of a crown pressed into the earth. The second village fought back. Fire, arrows, prayer. It made no difference. The fire burned cold. The arrows bent in midair. The prayers returned as laughter. Aldrich walked through the flames untouched. Brannock followed, whispering, not in rage, but in devotion. One survivor, a boy of no more than 9, crawled through the ash and said he had heard the knight speak not to the king, but to the metal in his own hand. It speaks clearer than any man. It tells me how to become more. The Order had once said the crown remembered. They were wrong. It desired. And now it wanted more than memory. It wanted divinity. The 10 shards called out across the realm, each one pulling toward those with the deepest wounds, the heaviest regrets, the darkest wishes. In temples, in caves, in graveyards, in riverbeds, they sang. Not in sound, but in need. One was found in the hand of a dying midwife who had once drowned her child. Another in the chest of a bishop who had burned books for gold. Each shard whispered, "You are already broken. Let me make you whole." Brannock grew stronger. He stopped wearing his helmet. His skin cracked like clay, and the light behind his eyes shimmered like something ancient trying to wake. He no longer obeyed Aldrich. He walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, an equal. And Aldrich did not object, because Aldrich had begun to fade. His flesh wasted, his eyes dimmed, and Brannock began to speak more. The shard in his chest had grown. It now pulsed like a second heart, pressing through his breastplate like an ember searching for air. He said to Aldrich, "You are a crown bearer. I will be the crown." In the ruins of the Chapel of Thorns, Brannock raised a hand and the dead rose to kneel. Not zombies, not puppets, but memories made flesh, the sins of those buried their given eyes and limbs. He did not flinch. He gave them names. He made them his choir, and from their mouths came not screams, but hymns, songs of the shard, songs of the hunger, songs that bent trees and boiled rivers and shattered glass from towers miles away. One of the last remaining bells in the northern woods cracked down the center. The forest died that night. Birds flew into the sea. The scream was no longer a thing to survive. It was becoming worship, and worship requires sacrifice. Elena watched from the high cliffs of WRM's spine. She had survived too long. She had walked with the scream. She had cracked it. She had buried her mask. She had burned her hands carrying the silent Fong's remains back to the root from which it was forged. And now she was hunted, because she had heard the scream and did not kneel. The shards feared her, but they also wanted her, because the scream remembered love, and in her it had once been soothed. Villages began to offer themselves willingly. To Brannock, to the hunger, they brought him blood in bowls, carved their dreams into stone, offered up their sins like prayers. And in return, he gave them silence. Sweet, echoing silence. The final temple of the morning bell fell at dusk. The order had returned there, desperate, calling upon their dead. They were no masks now, only sorrow. And when Brannock entered, alone, carrying no weapon, they knew they had already lost. He did not speak. He placed the shard on the altar. It hovered, and the temple screamed. Not once, not loud, but in memory. And when it ended, nothing remained, not even dust. Brannock stood above the ruins. He looked to the sky, and he whispered, "Crown me." The shard sank fully into his chest, and the scream answered. He did not fall. He did not rise. He became still. Then his body cracked, from scalp to navel, and from within spilled not organs, but light, silver, laced with red, not fire, memory. He was no longer man, not king, something older, something waiting. Aldrich watched, forgotten now, a husk. He said nothing. He wept, because the crown had never wanted a king. It had always wanted a god, and now it had one, and it was still hungry. They said Eric had vanished into the mountain, after the forging of the crown, when the blades of 10 traitors were melted, when his hands blackened from flame that was not flame, when the whispers first licked the walls of his mind, he was never seen again. Some said he had died. Others said the scream had swallowed him whole. A few believed he had wandered into the hollow caves and become stone. But the truth, as always, was far stranger. He had not died. He had been waiting. In the coldest part of the realm, where the sky forgets how to dawn and the stars blink like dying embers, there stands a forge built beneath the earth. No roads lead to it. No maps mark its place. Its chimney does not smoke, it breathes frost. And on a night when Brannock crowned himself with the scream's blessing, when villages wept tears of iron and the rivers ran with silence, something stirred deep below. A hammer rang. Then again. Then louder. And the mountain trembled. Eric awoke in darkness. He did not see it. He had not seen anything for years. His eyes were long burned away by the memory of the crown. But he felt the shape of the world through vibration, the way metal hums when it's about to break, the way screams crackle in the air before they're born. He stood slowly, body stiff like cooled steel, and reached for his hammer. It glowed, not with flame, but with memory. Red hot, pulsing, hungry. He spoke not a word, but the forge did. It whispered, "It still breathes. It grows. It must be undone." He placed the hammer on the anvil and touched the ancient tongs, long rusted, but loyal. The coals beneath the forge pit had not burned in centuries. Yet as his hand hovered, they bloomed back to life. Not fire, a flame that screamed instead of crackled. A heat that knew his name. The walls of the forge were covered in old sketches. Swords that were never forged. Armor made of bone. Blueprints for things that should not exist. But among them was one drawing Eric had never finished. A blade, curved like the crescent of a dying moon, hollow down its core. A blade that made no sound when drawn. It was called, in ink scratched with ash, silence. Not the silent Fong. That had failed. It had been forged from betrayal. This would be forged from what came after betrayal, the void left behind. To unmake the scream, Eric understood now, he must forge a blade not to cut flesh, but memory itself. Not from iron, from forgetting. He reached into the drawer beneath the anvil and pulled out a strip of cloth. Black, stitched with hair, soaked in the tears of those who had survived the scream. It had once belonged to Elena. She had left it for him before disappearing into the hills. On it were names, not of kings, not of gods, but of those the crown had devoured. He read them with his fingers, and the forge wailed. To forge silence, he would need 3 things: the breath of a child who no longer remembered their name, the bone of a god who had once been man, and a moment of stillness, perfect, unbroken, unshaken. He would find them, or the scream would never end. Word spread quickly, though no messenger spoke it aloud. The blacksmith had returned, and the forge screamed with him. Those still loyal to the crown felt it first, the burning in their chests, the splitting of dreams, the feeling of being watched by something older than hate. Brannick heard the hammer's echo in his sleep, and when he woke, his hand had curled into a fist without knowing why. He whispered to the shard inside him, "He dares." The shard pulsed. "Let him come." The scream, which had once obeyed Brannick, now wavered, because it remembered Eric, the first, the forger, the one who had shaped it, and the scream, for all its hunger, still feared the hand that had made it. In a dead village called Korhallow, Eric found the first piece. A child, alone, eyes empty, mouth silent. She sat in the middle of a field where no crops grew, carving circles into the dirt. When he approached, she did not flee. She only said, "What's my name?" He did not answer. He knelt and listened. She breathed in, a long, quiet breath, and he caught it in a vial made of melted prayer. The second piece came from a tomb forgotten by even the morning bell. A grave carved beneath a lake, sealed by the weight of regret. Eric entered without breath, without torch. The walls whispered his sins back to him, but he did not flinch. He found the skull where the water met the stone, cracked, crowned, broken. The remains of Roderick, victim. He broke a sliver from the jaw, and the scream above ground howled. The third piece, the stillness, was hardest. The world did not know silence anymore. Every inch hummed with memory. Even the wind wept. But in a cave where the scream had never echoed, too far, too deep, he found it. A single second. Frozen. He bottled it in a jar made from his own fingernails, wrapped it in hair, and returned to the forge. The hammer rose. The blade began, not in fire, but in breath, in pause, in sorrow. Each strike brought no sound, only heat. Each clang pressed the world quieter. The forge dimmed. The sky outside turned black. And then the scream returned. Brannick came, not with an army, not with a host of rot. Alone. He stepped into the forge with the arrogance of gods. His armor no longer metal, bone and blood and echo. His voice layered with centuries. "You built me." Eric turned, blind eyes forward. "I built a prison. You let it out." Brannick stepped forward. "You cannot unmake me. I am the scream's will." Eric smiled, a small, cracked smile. Then hear its last breath. The blade was finished, curved, hollow, gray like ash before it fades. It hummed not with sound, but with absence. Brannick drew his weapon, a sword shaped like memory. Eric held his in silence. And the forge broke. The wall screamed. The scream outside screamed back. And the final war of silence began. No one recorded what happened. No one remembered who struck first. Only this. When it ended, the mountain stood still. No blood spilled. No graves cracked. Just one whisper. "It is done." Brannick was gone. The shard melted into rain, and the scream fell silent, truly, forever. Eric dropped the blade, cracked, split, and vanished. His hammer turned cold. His hands stopped trembling. He sat beside the forge, and for the first time in centuries, he slept. No whispers, no breath, no scream, just silence. There are blades forged for war, blades forged for vengeance, blades forged for kings. And then there is one blade that must never be forged. Its name is never spoken. It does not echo in stories told around fires. No bard dares sing it, no scroll dares hold its shape in ink. Even the scream avoided it, for it remembered how close it had come once before to ending. The blade of silence. It is not forged from steel, not molded in flame, not quenched in oil. It is formed from stillness, from choice, from grief sharpened into action. And it requires 2 impossible things: tears of the truly innocent, and the tongue of a prophet who chose silence. Elena had survived the crown. She had witnessed the scream when it first cracked the sky. She had walked through blood, shadow, and madness. She had lost her child. She had broken the silent fawn. She had watched gods die. And now she stood beneath a sky that had forgotten how to shine. The scream had quieted, yes, but the hunger had not. Brannick was gone, but his whispers still echoed in dreams. And the crown, or what was left of it, had begun to stir again, drawn toward those who still believed power could save them. She had no more strength to fight it, but she knew what had to be done. The blade must be forged, the blade that must not be forged. She crossed the ruins of Felsmeyer, where bells once rang but now hung limp in moss. She walked through villages where no one aged and no one remembered the names of their children. She passed wolves that bowed and trees that bled, until she found the place the scream had always avoided. A monastery with no name, built from stone so quiet it silenced the wind. A place sealed from history, a place that listened without judgment. Within its walls lived one man, the priest with no voice. He had once been a prophet. It was said his words could bend rivers, that he had spoken a kingdom into rebellion and peace into ashes. But 40 years ago, he had stood atop the broken hill, looked into the storm of war he had caused, and closed his mouth. He had not spoken since. Not one word, not one sigh, not even a prayer. Some said he was cursed, others said he was wise. But those who understood said he was preparing, waiting for someone who needed him more than history. Elena entered the monastery alone. She did not knock. The stone opened for her. The silence inside was louder than any scream she had ever heard. He was waiting at the center, seated cross-legged before a pool of still water, surrounded by books he had never read. His face was marked with age, but his eyes were ageless. She said nothing. She knelt before him and opened her hands. Within them, she carried a shard, not of the crown, but of her son's memory. A locket, a drawing, a carved wolf's head from wood. She placed them gently between them and wept, not loudly, not theatrically, but purely. 2 tears struck the stone floor and vanished into the cracks. And he smiled. He stood and nodded. No bargain was made, no words exchanged, no binding oath spoken, only understanding. He walked to the far chamber of the monastery, where no one had stepped in 40 years. There, in the center, was a forge that had never been lit, because it required no fire, only silence. Elena stood beside him. She held the locket. The blade's shape flickered in the shadows, not metal, but potential. The priest knelt. He reached into his robe and withdrew a blade. A small one. Simple. He held it to his own mouth and pressed. It did not bleed. His tongue was not flesh. It was memory. And when it fell from his mouth, the silence in the room became absolute. The forge sighed. And then, without spark or fuel, it lit. The tears of the innocent, the tongue of the willingly silenced, and the locket of a mother who had never forgotten. The forge accepted them, and the blade of silence began to shape itself. It did not glow. It did not scream. It did not sing. It simply formed, like thought turned to steel. It curved in upon itself, like regret becoming resolve. When it was done, it hovered in the air, untouched by hands, unclaimed by history. And Elena reached out. The moment she touched the hilt, the monastery crumbled. Not from weight, from completion. Its purpose fulfilled, the stones returned to dust, the wind rushed back in, and the world remembered sound. But the blade of silence made no noise. It shimmered like a shadow. And in that stillness, the scream twitched. Far away, in a castle rebuilt from rot and ambition, the last loyal follower of the crown collapsed in prayer. Not from devotion, but from fear, because the scream had stopped listening to him and started listening for her. The crown no longer sought a king. It had failed to become a god. Now it wanted only one thing, to not be forgotten. And the blade in her hand was memory's final death. Elena walked, past rivers that fled from her reflection, past birds that dropped silent from the sky, The blade did not glow, but it demanded. It did not shout, but it compelled. And with every step she took, another voice fell quiet. Another echo dissolved. Another scream died. She would not strike with it. She would not raise it in battle. She would do only one thing: bring it home, to where it all began, to the mouth of the root beneath Eldgrave, the place where memory first bled, where Eric first whispered to flame, where 10 traitors screamed as they were forged into one. And there she would place the blade, not in rage, not in vengeance, but in silence, and let it end, not with fire, but with forgetting. The scream felt her coming, and it began to tremble, because it had ruled for centuries. But even kings, even gods, must fade, and only silence is eternal. It began with silence, too deep to hear, too still to notice, the kind of silence that comes not before the storm, but after the world realizes it cannot stop it. The blade of silence had been forged, and the sky knew. Elena had not yet raised it. She had not drawn it from the shrine where the monastery once stood. She had not spoken its purpose. But the world was already listening, and the stars, long distant, long quiet, long absent from the earth's quarrels, began to scream. The first one fell over the sea of cries, a streak of blue fire that split the horizon in half. No one saw it, but everyone heard it, a sound like fabric tearing inside their bones. The second came an hour later, shattering across the sky in a spiral of green light. It struck the mountains near Eldgrave. Rock melted, wolves howled, water boiled. The third never hit the ground. It hovered, and it bled. Not fire, not ash, but light that wept like memory. All across the realm, villagers woke with mouths full of soot. Their dreams had caught fire. Children clutched their ears as lullabies turned to whispers. Horses refused to ride. Bells rang without touch. And in the heart of the chaos, in the throneless ruins of the crown's keep, Aldrich began to scream. He had not spoken in weeks. Not since Brannock rose and fell. Not since the crown had begun feeding on his mind like a leech left too long. Not since the scream had settled inside him like a second spine. But now, as the sky cracked, he screamed. Not in pain, in remembrance. The scream inside him was awakening, but not as before, not as wrath, not as hunger, not as dominion, as panic. The blade was near. The crown upon Aldrich's head began to shake, not visibly, but internally, as if the metal remembered it had once been forged from betrayal and now feared being undone. Aldrich convulsed. His eyes rolled back. The stone beneath his feet began to splinter, and one by one, the knights sworn to him, those still alive, those still breathing in the rot of obedience, fell to their knees. The first ripped out his own tongue. The second drove his gauntlet into his face until his skull caved inward. The third wept until his eyes bled dry. None of them died. They rose, empty, but awake, and began to hum. A melody the scream had never sung before. A lullaby for the end of memory. Far across the fields, Elena stood still beneath the blade's shrine. The stars above her twisted like broken compass needles. The wind had stopped entirely. Birds hovered, wings spread, frozen mid-flight. The blade of silence pulsed at her side. Not with heat, with stillness. It did not whisper. It waited. It did not threaten. It remembered. And in Eldgrave, Aldrich collapsed. The crown fused to his skull now, no longer separate. A prison no longer worn. A throne with no seat. And it began to wail, not as a sound, but as a force. Windows shattered in towns 100 miles away. Trees bent backwards. Words were forgotten mid-sentence. The stars continued to fall. They weren't meteors. Not truly. They were the last lights of memory, torn free from the fabric of time, dragged screaming across the firmament as if begging not to be forgotten. Because the blade of silence did not destroy. It erased, and the sky remembered everything. The monks in the Vale of Ash fell to their knees, clutching scrolls that no longer held writing. The elder trees in the northwoods cracked open, releasing the laughter of children who had died centuries before. And in the ancient crypt beneath Eldgrave, where King Roderick's cursed bones once lay, the earth swallowed itself, unable to contain the weight of what had been done. The world was shedding its story, and so Elena walked. With each step toward Eldgrave, the stars wept harder. The wind wept louder, but she did not flinch, because she understood now. The scream had always feared silence, but not because it would be destroyed, because it would be unwritten, and things that are unwritten never existed. Inside the keep, the surviving knights stood in a circle of glass and blood, chanting without tongues. Their eyes were gone. Their hands fused together. They stood not as soldiers, but as a wall, a barrier of memory. Each one bore a scar from the crown, and each one had offered a piece of themselves to keep it alive. Now they were nothing but memory's last gatekeepers, and the blade was coming for them. Aldrich rose. Barely. He walked, dragged, staggered toward the gate. The crown blazed red. His mouth opened, and 100 voices spoke at once. I am every betrayal. I am every scream. I will not be forgotten. Elena passed the final tree. Its bark peeled away as she neared, revealing runes that wrote themselves backward. Her name etched there, then erased. She stepped onto Eldgrave's stone, and the ground cracked. The stars had nearly all fallen. Only one remained, hung above the keep, still silent, waiting. The crown screamed again. Aldrich collapsed, and the knights charged, but they could not reach her. Not because she fought, because the blade wept, and every step forward they took was erased from time. Their limbs faded mid-motion. Their swords vanished from memory. They screamed, but their screams did not echo, because the stars had taken sound with them. And when Aldrich reached the center of the keep, the crown still fused to his head, his flesh rotted and his memories tangled. He looked at Elena, and saw not a woman, but a story ending. She raised the blade. It made no sound. The sky stopped burning. The last star flickered. And in that moment, a heartbeat held longer than time allowed. The scream finally understood. It was never alive. It had only ever been remembered. And now it was being let go. The blade came down, not with force, not with fury, but with forgiveness. It touched the stone, not Aldrich, not the crown, just the place where it had all begun. And the keep collapsed. In silence. No dust, no ruin, no echo, just stillness. The stars stopped screaming. The wind began to breathe, and the scream finally stopped, forever. There are places in this world that remember when gods bled. Places that never heal. Places where silence is not peace, but warning. Eldgrave Keep was one such place. Its towers no longer reached the sky. Its windows had melted into ash. Its halls echoed not with voices, but memories that refused to fade. And beneath it, deeper than the bones of kings, deeper than betrayal itself, waited the crown forge. A pit not made of stone, not dug by hand, but grown from agony. It was time to return. The sky had silenced. The stars no longer screamed, but the scream itself had not died. It had retreated to the place it was born. The Order of the Morning Bell stood at the edge of the ruin, cloaks torn, faces pale. Their numbers had thinned. Betrayal had eaten half of them. Silence had claimed more. But those that remained did not tremble. Not anymore, because they knew this was not a journey for victory. It was a descent. Eric stood tall beside Elena. His hammer, long cooled, now pulsed faintly red in his hand. He had not spoken since the forging of the Blade of Silence. He did not need to. The blade hummed in Elena's grasp. It did not glow, but the air around it bent, like time remembering something it wished it hadn't. She looked down into the ruins. No staircase led below. No rope, no ladder, no steps carved by man. Only a tear in the earth, wide and waiting, as if Eldgrave itself had grown tired of holding the scream captive. She stepped forward, and the world dimmed. The pit swallowed them, not in speed, but in weight. Each step downward felt like dragging centuries behind their backs. The walls were not stone. They pulsed. Dark veins ran like cracks along the passage, humming with a heartbeat not their own. The order lit no torches. The light would have only lied. For down here, truth had no need of sight. As they moved deeper, the air began to taste wrong. Like blood on old parchment. Like forgotten names. Like prayers said backward. Elena could feel it, the pull. Not on her body. On her story. The crown was remembering her. It knew she was coming. And it was ready. They passed bones that wept. Statues of knights twisted backward, arms clawing at their own mouths. Carvings of kings with no faces. And at the lowest bend, a doorway. Shaped not by hammer, but by grief. A perfect arch, wrapped in tendrils of blackened steel, humming gently like a lullaby trapped in a noose. The forge lay beyond. It was not a room. It was not a hall. It was not a place. It was a wound. The chamber was circular, endlessly so. A loop that never ended. The floor was obsidian, the ceiling lost in shadow. In the center, the crown forge. A pit, wide as a castle, bottomless, silent, alive. From its edge, soft wails rose like steam. And around it, floating in slow circles, were pieces of the scream, voices that had once ruled men, now stripped of shape, of sound, of mercy. And above it all, suspended by nothing, the crown. It had changed. No longer gold. Not iron, but bone. Its edges jagged. Its center hollow. Its points curved like teeth. It did not sit on a throne. It was the throne. And it saw them. The pit trembled. The order fell to one knee. Their ears bled. Their minds cracked. One screamed a name no one had ever heard before, not in this lifetime. Eric held firm, but his skin split like old leather. Elena stood tall, though her vision blurred and her legs buckled. The blade in her hand began to scream, not aloud, but inside. It did not fear the crown. It hated it. The crown spoke, not with words, with remembrance. Images flared in Elena's mind. Her son, laughing, burning, reborn in smoke. Eric hammering in the dark, his hands melting. The order's founder, vomiting locusts onto sacred texts. A newborn stabbed in the shadow of a wedding. A night dancing with corpses. The scream was showing them everything it had been. Everything it had fed on. Everything it still was. But Elena did not flinch. She stepped forward. The crown hovered. Her blade rose. The forge beneath hissed. "You cannot kill me," the scream said. Elena's mouth stayed shut. "I am every broken oath." Her feet crossed the final stone. "I am the rot in memory." The blade burned cold in her hand. "I am what remains when hope dies." And then the scream made a mistake. "Sit. I am your son's scream." Eric shouted. Elena swung. The blade struck the ground at the crown center. And the forge split. Not open. Inward. The crown fell. Straight into the pit. And the scream, it howled. Not in fury. In fear. The pit widened. The forge collapsed. The walls of memory shattered. Voices shrieked as they were dragged downward. The ground cracked beneath the order. One by one, the keep above caved. The sky tore. The world gasped. And still Elena stood. The blade, embedded now in the edge of the forge, hummed quietly. Eric reached out, but stopped. Because Elena was no longer weeping. She was smiling. The scream tried to claw upward, but the blade held firm. It was not silence. It was refusal. And the scream, for all its agony, was being denied. The forge began to collapse. Elena turned to Eric. "Go." His blind eyes shook. The order fled, pulled back by stone hands rising from the pit to usher them out. Eric lingered. But the wind whispered, not with words, but with peace. He bowed and left. Elena stood alone, above the forge, with the blade humming, and the crown screaming. And for the first time, she spoke. One word. Enough. The pit exploded in light, but made no sound. And Eldgrave was no more. Not ruined. Not buried. But forgotten. The world did not shatter all at once. It split in pieces, memory first, then time, then truth. And from those cracks rose a sound unlike any other. A scream that bled. Eldgrave was not supposed to rise again. Not after the forge collapsed. Not after the scream was drowned in silence. Not after Elena descended with the blade. But some things, some curses, do not obey stories. Some scream until the end writes them out. And so, above the broken roots of memory, in a sky scorched black and crimson, the keep began to rebuild. Not by stone, not by hand, but by scream. It grew backwards, a reversal of decay. Blood surged from the cracks in the earth and wove into battlements. Armor rusted shut around skeletons that had never sworn allegiance. Banners formed from ash and crow feathers. And atop the highest tower of the reborn fortress, on a throne forged of rotted tongues and shattered names, sat Aldrich. But he was no longer man, no longer duke, no longer even vessel. He was part metal now, fused by the crown, sharpened by memory, carved by scream. His face was hidden behind a helm that wept molten shadow. His right arm, a blade, his left hollow. And around him circled 10 knights of the grave, voices that once fed the crown, now chained to his breath. He had not moved in days, but he was awake, and the scream inside him was starving. The order returned first. Clothed in mourning ash and silver roots, they gathered on the scorched field before the keep. Each had sworn their death to silence, but now they raised their voices one final time, not in defiance, but in mourning, not for themselves, for the world. Then came the monks of the Veil, their eyes sewn shut. The blacksmiths' guild, dragging their anvils behind them like coffins. The lost sons of Roderick, broken but unbent. And finally, Elena. She walked barefoot. No armor, no shield. The blade of silence, once whole, now cracked down the center, wrapped in the remnants of her son's tunic. It should not still hum, but it did, because the scream wasn't dead yet. Thunder rippled, not from storm, but from memory. Each warrior who took their place on the battlefield remembered something different. A burned village, a sister who stopped singing, a child who never returned, a home without a name. Each memory fed the scream. And Aldrich rose. He did not speak. The crown did. A chorus of thousands, in every voice but his. Your silence did not kill us. Your blade only fed us. And now we wear the end as armor. Aldrich raised his hand, and the world tilted. From the battlements leapt horrors, creatures forged from shadow and regret. Knights with no faces, banners stitched from living skin. Horses that galloped upside down through the air. Drums made from the ribs of poets. The final battle had begun. Elena charged first, not because she had courage, but because she was already dead to fear. The order followed. Screams met them in the sky, echoes weaponized. Every step forward was like pushing against a tide of screaming teeth. But they pressed on, because silence cannot beg. The first clash shattered stone. Eric's hammer glowed, striking down the shadow things with every breathless blow. But for each fallen, 3 rose. The scream was duplicating itself, feeding on fear, feeding on rage, feeding on hope. Elena reached the gates. The 10 knights awaited her. Each had once been a king. Now they wore memory like armor. She swung. The blade of silence sang. One knight fell, his armor turned to dust. But the blade cracked again. Second swing, another gone. Crack widened. Fourth, parried. Fifth, the blade shattered. Not into shards, into whispers. Each piece drifted upward like dead feathers. And Elena fell to one knee. Aldrich stepped down from the throne. His legs made no sound. His eyes burned red. And the scream inside him exhaled. You cannot kill me, because you remember me. Elena rose. No blade, no weapon, only memory. She stepped forward, and from the dust of her feet, the blade reformed. Not in her hand, in the air, held not by flesh, but by silence itself. It spun once, then again, then flung forward like a final breath. Aldrich raised his arm. The scream inside him wailed, and the blade struck, not his body, but the crown. Cracked. 1,000 voices gasped, and the keep shuddered. The ground split, the banners burned, the knights disintegrated, and Aldrich laughed, not because he had won, because he had lost. And now the scream was free. It poured out not as wind, not as sound, but as memory itself. A wave of faces, names, grief, oaths, betrayals. It swept across the battlefield. The order dissolved. The monks turned to light. Even Eric dropped to one knee, whispering a name no one heard. Only Elena stood, because she was no longer a person. She was the end of the story. She closed her eyes. The blade shattered again. The scream tried to reach her, but it couldn't, because she no longer remembered. She had let go. And in that moment, the scream died, not with fury, but with a sigh. A long, tired, final sigh. Aldrich collapsed. The crown broke. The keep turned to dust. And the battlefield was silent, but not peaceful. Not yet, because something had been released. And not all stories end. Some just wait. There are crowns that rule men. There are crowns that command armies. And then there is the crown that rules screams. It had never been meant for a head, only for memory. And now, after blood and betrayal, fire and silence, death and unmaking, it remained. Shattered, yet hungry, still whispering. Elena stood in the heart of Eldgrave, surrounded by what could no longer be called a keep. It was not ruins. It was not ash. It was bones and dust, and the scream, still pulsing beneath it all like a severed heart refusing to stop beating. She had broken the blade. She had watched Aldrich fall. But the scream lived on, rootless, crownless, wild. It was no longer bound to metal or man. It was in the wind, in the soil, in the blood that soaked the ground. It had no throne, so it sought one. The members of the order who survived had begun to retreat, but the ground beneath them trembled, not from battle, but from memory reawakening. Faces appeared in the stone, not carved but grown. Screams echoed not from throats, but from reflections. And the whisper returned. There must always be one. The crown cannot be empty. The scream must wear a name. Elena closed her eyes. She had fought with silence. She had carried the blade. She had buried her son beneath her steps. But she had not forgotten. And that was the scream's last foothold. She turned back toward the shattered crown. Its pieces floated midair, spinning, drifting, singing in broken tones, bits of battle hymns, curses, lullabies from long-dead mothers. It called her name, not aloud, but through every scar she bore. Eric limped forward, hand outstretched, but his breath caught in his throat. He had seen enough metal fuse to flesh to know what the crown would do. The monks fell to their knees, clutching talismans that crumbled in their hands. The sky turned red, not from fire, but from history bleeding back into the world. She stepped forward. Each piece of the crown drifted closer. They began forming, not into a band, but into a web. A cage. A trap. Because the scream did not want to rule. It wanted to feed. And only from within could it be caged. Elena knew this, and she did not flinch. She took a breath, and placed the pieces of the crown on her head. At first, nothing. Then a sound. A soft gasp, like a baby's first breath. Then louder, like a beast waking. Then louder, like cities burning. Her scream. It tore through the keep like a comet. Windows exploded, even those that had no glass. The trees near Eldgrave split open, bleeding sap like tears. The sky cracked. Not thunder, not storm, but time itself. Birds turned to ash mid-flight. Rats leapt from their burrows, their eyes already blind. And Elena rose, not by force, but by scream. Her feet lifted from the ground, her arms outstretched. The crown now whole again, but grown. More than before. Its edges dripped with fire. Its voice roared through her. And still, her scream, the loudest of all, kept the scream inside her from escaping. She was not resisting it. She was trapping it. And the cost was everything. The knights who had once followed Aldrich tried to flee. They melted into bone and salt. The monks vanished mid-prayer. The battlefield buckled. And the keep, what remained of it, began to lift from the ground. Not rise, but as if torn from the earth by the weight of what it had held for centuries. Elena, still suspended, still screaming, began to glow. Not light, but memory. Every scream ever heard was now hers, and she would keep them caged. Eric tried to reach her. He screamed her name. No sound. The closer he stepped, the more he forgot. Her face blurred. Her name slipped away. Her voice replaced by thunder. And still she screamed. Not for pain, not for release, but to hold it all within. The ground shattered. A column of fire erupted beneath the keep. The crown burned white. And Elena, still floating, still glowing, still silent save for that endless scream, began to collapse inward. Not die. Collapse. Like a story folding into itself. The keep followed. Walls twisted. Stone warped. Everything screamed. And then all at once, the keep imploded. A cyclone of dust. Of fire. Of bones and forgotten oaths. It rose into the heavens like a pillar of judgment. And then, nothing. Silence. The real kind. Not cursed. Not magical. But silent. Where Eldgrave once stood, there was now a crater. Smooth. Perfect. Untouched. No blood. No bones. No blade. Only silence. The scream was gone. Caged in the only vessel strong enough to hold it. A mother's grief. And for the first time in an age, the wind moved again. It did not whisper. It did not weep. It breathed. The survivors of the Order never spoke of that day. Because they couldn't. Not because they were forbidden. Because to speak of it was to remember it. And remembering would invite it back. Eric lived only 7 more days. He carved her name into a tree where no one could see it. Then placed his hammer in the dirt. And walked into the woods. The monks scattered. The cities rebuilt. And eventually, Eldgrave was erased from maps, forgotten in tales, ignored in prayers. But sometimes, on nights when the wind is still, children speak of a sound just beyond hearing. A voice, a scream, or maybe a woman, still screaming, so the world can rest. Centuries pass differently where screams once lived. Time does not heal there. It hardens. The world had moved on. Kingdoms rose and fell. New gods were worshipped. Old names faded into dust. But Eldgrave, or what once was, never quite disappeared. It did not rise again. It did not burn. It simply waited. The crater where the keep had imploded had filled in with ash and wild grass. No stone remained. No ruins to mark the place. Only a ring of trees, all twisted eastward, as if bowing to something beneath the soil. Locals called it the Hollow Hill. Farmers tilled around it. Children were told not to play there. Not because of danger, because of echoes. The first voice came on a windless night. 3 boys, armed with stolen torches and foolish courage, snuck into the Hollow Hill. They knocked on the trunk of the oldest tree, blackened bark, branches sharp as antlers. They laughed. One joked about the old myths. One called out for Aldrich. One dared the dead to rise. Only one heard the whisper, "The crown sleeps." They all ran. 2 never spoke of it again. The 3rd didn't need to. He stopped speaking altogether. And when asked why, he would only press his ear to the ground and smile. Rumors returned like old debts. Villagers spoke of a humming in the rocks, of birds refusing to fly over the grove, of wells that echoed with faint sobs when no one was near. And once, just once, of a child who vanished for 3 days and returned with her hair turned white and a name in her mouth that no one recognized, Elena. But the world was louder now. Steel had replaced sword. Maps had no room for cursed craters. Myths were sold in books, not whispered at night. And so, the Hollow Hill became a tale. A challenge. Children dared each other to knock on the stone that lay in its center. Smooth, unbroken, cold in summer, warm in winter, and always, always silent. Unless you knocked. And waited. The girl who stayed longest was named Mara. 14. Curious. Foolish. She did not believe in ghosts. She believed in echoes. She came alone, waited until dusk, laid her palm on the stone, and whispered, "Why are you sleeping?" The air thickened. Her heart skipped. And from beneath the stone, A breath answered, because the scream still dreams. She did not run. She returned the next day, and the next, and the next. The grove changed, not visibly, but it knew her now. The trees bent deeper, the wind circled tighter, and the stone, for the first time in an age, cracked. A line, barely visible, but it hummed. And when Mara pressed her ear against it, she heard a scream, but not of pain, of remembrance. Elders began to worry. They forbade her from returning. She didn't argue. She just stopped speaking altogether. They tried to make her talk. Priests, healers, strangers from the capital. But all she did was trace a crown in the dirt. Over and over, never the same twice. And then came the storm, not of weather, of memory. It began with birds falling dead from the sky. Then mirrors cracking on their own. Then dreams. Everyone in the village shared the same nightmare. A woman, crowned in bone, standing in a sea of screaming roots, whispering, "Do not wake it." But something already had. The stone split in two. The trees caught fire, but did not burn. The air went still, and in the center of the hollow hill, a throne rose. Not of gold, not of iron, not even of bone, but of names. Thousands etched into it, some readable, some not, all forgotten. Until now, the villagers gathered in terror. Some fell to their knees, others tried to run, but no one could leave, not while the air still hummed. And from the cracked earth, she rose. Elena, not alive, not dead, not even spirit, but memory. She had not aged. She had not changed. She was the scream, now caged in silence. And she spoke. "It is not over." Then she vanished. The crown remained behind, hovering above the throne. And beneath it, carved in ancient tongue, the scream must rest, but it will never die. And there must always be a watcher. The village built a shrine around the hollow hill. They stopped calling it cursed. They started calling it sacred. Children no longer dared each other to knock. They left offerings instead. Ribbons, tears, names of loved ones who died screaming. And sometimes, when dusk was just right, the wind whispered back. Sometimes it said, "Shoo." Sometimes it said, "Her scream still holds it." And sometimes, rarely, it said, "One day, the crown will call again." And those who heard it never spoke again. They didn't need to. They remembered. So the myth grew, a tale not of fear, but of warning. The world built over Eldgrave, but the scream was always there, in the cracks, in the stones, in the silence before sleep. And in every story passed from one frightened child to another, they say, there was once a crown that ruled not kingdoms, but screams, forged from traitors, fed by kings, and buried inside the only heart strong enough to hold it. And even now, centuries later, if you press your ear to the stone, you may hear it stir. You may hear the crown breathe. And if you listen closely enough, you may hear her voice whisper one final warning. Do not wake it, because some screams should never find a throne again. The crown sleeps, but myths? They never truly die. Somewhere beneath the roots of forgotten kingdoms, screams still echo in stone, waiting for the next soul brave enough or foolish enough to listen. If this tale stirred something in your bones, a chill, a whisper, a name you don't remember knowing, then you've heard the call. Subscribe now to Dark Ages, medieval myths and forgotten kingdoms, where every legend hides a truth and every truth bleeds. Because this was not the last cursed crown. And the next one might be watching you. Tap the bell. Stay wary. And never forget, his crown was forged in blood and screams.